The Russians trace their origins to the East Slavs, one of the three main branches of the ancient Slavic people, East, West, and South Slavs. By the 6th century CE, the East Slavs began to settle in the forested and steppe regions of Eastern Europe, including modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. In the 9th century, the East Slavs were united under the Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes ruled by the Varangians, Vikings, who played a crucial role in the state's formation. The Kievan Rus was centered around Kyiv, modern-day Ukraine, and Novgorod. The adoption of Christianity in 988 under Prince Vladimir marked a defining cultural moment, integrating Slavic traditions with Byzantine religious and cultural influences. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasion devastated the Kievan Rus, leading to the fragmentation of the state. Moscow, originally a small settlement, gradually rose to prominence in the 14th century, leveraging its strategic location and political alliances. Moscow's leaders eventually unified the surrounding principalities, laying the foundation for the Russian state. By the 16th century, under Ivan the Terrible, Muscovy had expanded significantly, consolidating power and proclaiming itself the Tsardom of Russia. Over the following centuries, Russia continued its expansion eastward into Siberia, southward into the Caucasus, and westward into Europe, creating a vast, multi-ethnic empire. The majority of Russians historically inhabited the European part of Russia, which includes major cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Nizhny Novgorod. This region remains the cultural, economic, and political heart of Russia. From the 16th century onward, Russians began to settle in Siberia, drawn by the fur trade, mineral resources, and agricultural opportunities. By the 19th century, Russian settlements stretched to the Pacific Ocean, including areas such as Vladivostok and Kamchatka. Russian expansion into the Caucasus and Central Asia during the 18th and 19th centuries brought many Russians to these regions as settlers, administrators, and military personnel. Today, significant Russian populations can be found in Kazakhstan and other former Soviet republics. There is a substantial Russian diaspora worldwide, with large communities in countries like the United States, Canada, Germany, Israel, and the Baltic states. These communities emerged from various waves of emigration, including those fleeing political upheaval, like the Russian Revolution, economic opportunities, or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Overall, Russians have a deep-rooted history that blends Slavic, Viking, Byzantine, and other influences, spreading across one of the most geographically vast territories in the world. The influence of Byzantium on the cultural development of the Russian people is profound and lasting, rooted primarily in the adoption of Christianity by the Kievan Rus in 988 AD under Prince Vladimir the Great. This pivotal event, often referred to as the Baptism of Rus, marked the beginning of a deep cultural, religious, and political connection with the Byzantine Empire. One of the most significant impacts was the introduction of Orthodox Christianity, which became the cornerstone of Russian spiritual life and cultural identity. Through Byzantium, the Russians adopted not only religious practices and the construction of churches in the Byzantine style, but also a rich liturgical tradition, religious art, and the Cyrillic alphabet, which was developed by Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius to translate religious texts into Slavic languages. Byzantine influence extended to the arts, where the Russians embraced iconography, a central aspect of Orthodox worship. These religious icons, along with frescoes and mosaics, decorated churches and monasteries, reflecting the distinct Byzantine aesthetic of intricate designs, vibrant colors, and spiritual symbolism. This artistic legacy shaped Russian religious art for centuries, fostering a unique style that combined Byzantine elements with local Slavic traditions. In terms of governance and legal traditions, Byzantine models also left a mark on the Russian state. The Kievan Rus and later Russian states adopted aspects of Byzantine court ceremonies, administrative practices, and legal codes, which helped to structure the developing Russian political culture. The concept of the Tsar as a ruler ordained by God was heavily influenced by the Byzantine notion of a divinely appointed emperor, reinforcing the close link between church and state in Russia. Byzantine philosophy and literature further influenced Russian thought, with translations of Byzantine texts introducing Russian scholars to a broader intellectual world. This exposure helped shape Russian theological debates, literature, and education, integrating Byzantine scholasticism into Russian learning. The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, emerging after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, symbolized the enduring legacy of Byzantium in Russia, positioning it as the spiritual and cultural heir to the Byzantine Empire. Overall, the influence of Byzantium was instrumental in shaping Russian religion, art, governance, and intellectual life, creating a unique cultural synthesis that profoundly impacted the Russian identity and continues to resonate in Russian culture today. Western Eurasia played a significant role in shaping the development of the Russian state, influencing it through a complex blend of cultural, economic, political, and military interactions over centuries. The influence began in the early medieval period, particularly through the interactions between the East Slavs and various neighboring groups, including the Vikings, who played a crucial role in the formation of the Kievan Rus. The Vikings, known as Varangians in Eastern Europe, not only helped unify Slavic tribes but also established key trade routes linking the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire, fostering early economic and cultural exchanges that helped solidify the early Russian state. The Mongol invasion in the 13th century, while devastating, indirectly connected Russia to the broader trade networks of Eurasia, including the Silk Road. This exposure allowed for the flow of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West, although under the shadow of Mongol domination. The Mongol period also influenced the military organization, administrative methods, and tax systems of Russian principalities, especially Moscow, which adapted these influences to consolidate power and eventually lead the unification of Russian lands. Western Eurasian influences became particularly pronounced during the reign of Peter the Great in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Peter's extensive travels through Western Europe inspired a series of reforms aimed at modernizing the Russian state along European lines. He introduced Western technologies, military tactics, and administrative reforms, including the establishment of a modern navy and the reorganization of the army on European models. Peter also sought to westernize Russian society by encouraging European dress, customs, and education, which helped shift Russia's orientation more towards Europe. The influence of Western Europe continued to grow, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, as Russia expanded westward and engaged in wars and alliances with European powers. Russian elites increasingly embraced European culture, art, philosophy, and political thought, which influenced Russian literature, music, and the development of science and education. The Enlightenment ideas that swept across Europe also found a receptive audience in Russia, contributing to debates about governance, law, and society, which eventually influenced reforms, such as those of Catherine the Great, who sought to incorporate Enlightenment principles into Russian law and governance. Western Eurasian influence also manifested in the form of economic integration, as Russia became a significant player in European trade, exporting raw materials and importing European manufactured goods and technologies. This economic interaction facilitated the growth of Russian cities and industries, further integrating Russia into the broader European economic sphere. Throughout history, Russia's relationship with Western Eurasia has been characterized by a blend of adaptation, conflict, and cooperation, which collectively shaped its development as a state. From the adoption of administrative practices and military technologies to cultural and intellectual exchanges, Western Eurasia's influence was a driving force behind Russia's transformation from a medieval state into a major European and global power. Between the 8th and 10th centuries, Western Eurasia was a dynamic region characterized by a diverse array of political formations and nomadic empires that influenced the broader geopolitical landscape. This period saw the rise and fall of various powers, including the Carolingian Empire in Western Europe, the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a series of nomadic empires and states across the steppes, each contributing to the region's complex history. The Carolingian Empire, founded by Charlemagne in the late 8th century, was one of the dominant political entities in Western Europe. It united much of modern-day France, Germany, and parts of Italy, establishing a revival of Roman imperial traditions and strengthening ties with the papacy. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 by Pope Leo III marked the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, which sought to continue the legacy of Roman rule in the West. However, by the 9th century, the Carolingian Empire faced fragmentation due to internal divisions and external pressures from Viking raids, Magyar invasions, and Muslim incursions from the Iberian Peninsula. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, was another significant political force in Western Eurasia during this period. As the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium maintained its influence over the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and parts of Italy. The empire was characterized by a complex bureaucracy, a strong military tradition, and a rich cultural life that preserved classical knowledge and Christian orthodoxy. Despite periodic conflicts with the Abbasid Caliphate to the south and the Bulgars and Slavs to the north, Byzantium remained a key power in the region, exerting cultural and political influence over neighboring states. In the vast Eurasian steppes, nomadic empires played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape. The Khazar Khaganate, a powerful Turkic state centered around the Volga River and the Caspian Sea, was one of the dominant nomadic empires of the 8th and 9th centuries. The Tsars controlled key trade routes between Europe and Asia and served as a buffer state between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. The Tsars were notable for their religious tolerance and the conversion of their elite to Judaism, which distinguished them from neighboring powers. To the west of the Tsars, the Magyars, a nomadic group of Uralic origin, migrated into the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century, establishing the foundations of what would become the Kingdom of Hungary. Their raids into Western Europe during the late 9th and early 10th centuries contributed to the destabilization of the region, but eventually led to their settlement and integration into the European feudal system. The Vikings, although not nomadic in the traditional sense, were seafaring warriors and traders from Scandinavia who profoundly impacted Western Eurasia during this period. Their raids, trade, and settlement activities reached as far as the British Isles, Francia, and the rivers of Eastern Europe, where they played a key role in the formation of early Russian states like the Kievan Rus. Viking expeditions contributed to the spread of goods, ideas, and cultural influences across Europe and beyond. This period also saw the ongoing influence of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, which, while centered further east in Baghdad, maintained political and cultural connections with Western Eurasia through trade and diplomacy. The Abbasids engaged in both conflict and cooperation with the Byzantines and other regional powers, influencing the economic and intellectual landscape of the time. Overall, Western Eurasia between the 8th and 10th centuries was a region of vibrant political and cultural interaction, marked by the rise of empires, the movements of nomadic peoples, and the continuous reshaping of borders and alliances. The interplay between sedentary states and nomadic powers defined the era, creating a complex and interconnected world. The First Russian Khaganate was a loosely organized political formation that emerged in Eastern Europe during the 8th and early 9th centuries, centered around the area of modern-day Kyiv and other territories along the Dnieper River. Its exact origins and nature are still debated by historians due to limited sources, but it is believed to have been a federation of Slavic and Norse, Varangian, tribes under the rule of a Khagan, a title borrowed from Turkic and Khazar traditions, indicating a ruler with supreme authority. This early political structure was influenced by trade, particularly along the river routes connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, which facilitated interactions with Byzantium and the Khazars. The Khaganate is thought to have played a role in organizing and controlling trade in the region, particularly in the movement of goods like furs, slaves, and silver. However, the First Russian Khaganate eventually declined, likely due to internal conflicts and external pressures, paving the way for the rise of more centralized states. The Kievan Rus, often referred to as the Kiev state, emerged in the late 9th century and is considered the first significant East Slavic state. It was founded by Varangian leaders, particularly Oleg of Novgorod, who seized control of Kyiv around 882, establishing it as the capital. The Kievan Rus expanded rapidly, uniting various Slavic tribes under a central authority and controlling key trade routes between Scandinavia, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. The state's economy was largely based on trade, tribute, and agriculture, with Kyiv becoming a prosperous hub due to its strategic location. The Kievan Rus reached its peak in the 10th and early 11th centuries under the rule of Vladimir the Great and his son Yaroslav the Wise. Vladimir's conversion to Christianity in 988 and the subsequent Christianization of the Rus marked a turning point in the state's development, aligning it culturally and politically with Byzantium. This helped to establish Orthodox Christianity as the dominant religion, influencing the social, cultural, and political life of the region. Yaroslav the Wise further strengthened the state by codifying laws, promoting education, and forging diplomatic ties with other European powers. Despite its successes, the Kyiv state was plagued by internal divisions, princely rivalries, and external threats, including raids by nomadic groups such as the Pecheneg and Cumans. By the 12th century, the Kievan Rus began to fragment into regional principalities, weakening central authority. The Mongol invasion in the 13th century dealt a final blow to the Kyiv state, leading to its collapse and the rise of new centers of power, such as Moscow and Novgorod. The legacy of the Kievan Rus profoundly influenced the cultural and political foundations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, laying the groundwork for the development of Eastern Slavic civilization. Russia's conversion to Christianity was primarily driven by Prince Saint Vladimir the Great, who ruled the Kievan Rus from 980 to 1015. Before Vladimir's reign, the Kievan Rus was a pagan society with a pantheon of gods worshipped by the East Slavs. Vladimir initially tried to strengthen his rule by unifying the diverse beliefs of his people under a reformed pagan religion, even erecting statues of the principal Slavic gods in Kyiv. However, Vladimir soon realized the limitations of paganism in consolidating his realm and sought a new faith that would unify his people and elevate his state in the eyes of neighboring powers. In his quest for a unifying religion, Vladimir reportedly considered several faiths, including Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity, Catholicism, and Eastern Christianity, Orthodoxy. According to the primary chronicle, a historical account of the Kievan Rus, Vladimir sent envoys to study these religions to determine which would be best for his people. The envoys returned with detailed reports, but it was their description of the splendor and majesty of Orthodox worship in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople that captivated Vladimir. Impressed by the power, culture, and influence of the Byzantine Empire, Vladimir saw an opportunity not only to unify his people under a single faith, but also to forge closer ties with Byzantium. In 988, Vladimir took a decisive step by negotiating a marriage alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, agreeing to convert to Christianity in exchange for marrying the emperor's sister, Princess Anna. This political and religious union was significant, as marriage into the Byzantine imperial family elevated Vladimir's status and cemented a strong alliance with Byzantium. To solidify his conversion, Vladimir was baptized in the Crimean city of Chersonesus, modern-day Sevastopol, and took the Christian name Basil. Following his baptism, Vladimir ordered the mass conversion of his subjects to Christianity. He returned to Kyiv and famously instructed his people to be baptized in the Dnieper River, effectively making Christianity the official religion of the Kievan Rus. Pagan idols were destroyed, and churches were built throughout the realm, including the Church of the Tithes in Kyiv, which symbolized the new Christian order. Vladimir's adoption of Christianity had profound implications. It not only unified the Kievan Rus but also integrated it culturally and politically into the broader Christian world, particularly Byzantium, influencing Russian art, law, and social customs for centuries to come. Vladimir's conversion is seen as a pivotal moment in Russian history, marking the beginning of a Christian tradition that would shape the identity and development of Russia and the Eastern Slavic world. Knyaz Yaroslav the Wise, who ruled the Kievan Rus from 1019 to 1054, was one of the most prominent and influential rulers in the history of medieval Russia. The son of Vladimir the Great, Yaroslav initially struggled for power, facing internal family conflicts typical of the Kievan Rus succession disputes. After defeating his brothers and securing his position, Yaroslav focused on consolidating and expanding his realm, which became one of the most powerful and culturally vibrant states in Europe during his reign. Yaroslav's politics were marked by efforts to strengthen the internal stability of the Kievan Rus through legal reforms, religious patronage, and the promotion of education and culture. One of his most notable achievements was the codification of the Russkaya Pravda, Russian justice, the first legal code of the Kievan Rus. This set of laws helped regulate social and economic life, dealing with issues such as property rights, trade, and criminal justice, thus laying the foundations for the legal tradition in Russia. The code sought to reduce internal conflicts and unify the legal practices of the diverse territories under Yaroslav's control. Yaroslav was also a fervent supporter of the Orthodox Church, continuing the Christianization policies begun by his father, Vladimir. He established the metropolis of Kyiv, built numerous churches, including the iconic St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv, and supported the translation of Greek religious texts into Slavic, fostering the spread of Orthodox Christianity and education among his people. This religious and cultural patronage strengthened the ties between the Kievan Rus and Byzantium, enhancing Kyiv's status as a major Christian center. Diplomatically, Yaroslav skillfully navigated relations with other European powers, using marriage alliances to secure his position and enhance the prestige of his dynasty. He married his daughters to prominent European rulers, including the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, earning him the nickname Father-in-law of Europe. These alliances helped position the Kievan Rus as a key player in European politics, fostering trade, cultural exchange, and military cooperation. Yaroslav's foreign policy also involved defending his realm against external threats, such as the Pecheneg, a nomadic tribe that frequently raided Kievan Rus territories. Yaroslav's military campaigns against the Pecheneg culminated in a decisive victory in 1036, after which he fortified Kyiv and other key cities, enhancing the security of his state. He also engaged in conflicts with neighboring states, including Poland and the Byzantine Empire, but often pursued diplomacy and treaties to maintain stability and expand his influence. Under Yaroslav the Wise, the Kievan Rus reached the height of its power, cultural development, and territorial expansion. His rule is often seen as a golden age, marked by legal and administrative reforms, military strength, and significant cultural achievements that left a lasting legacy on the development of Eastern Slavic civilization. However, despite his successes, Yaroslav's death led to renewed succession disputes among his sons, eventually contributing to the fragmentation of the Kievan Rus in the following decades. The division of Russia into principalities was a gradual process that unfolded during the 12th and 13th centuries, following the peak of the Kievan Rus under rulers like Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise. The primary cause of this fragmentation was the Kievan Rus system of succession, which was based on a complex and often unstable rotation among the ruling family's members rather than a direct line of inheritance. This succession system led to fierce rivalries among the princes, each vying for control over the most prosperous and strategic cities, particularly Kyiv. As the central authority weakened, the vast territories of the Kievan Rus began to splinter into semi-independent principalities, each governed by a prince with his own administration, military, and economic policies. Notable principalities included Novgorod, Vladimir Suzdal, Galicia Volhynia, Chernigov, and Smolensk, among others. These principalities often operated independently and frequently clashed with each other over territory, trade routes, and influence, further eroding any sense of unified governance. The rise of regional centers of power such as Novgorod and Vladimir Suzdal signaled a shift away from Kyiv, which gradually lost its political and economic significance due to ongoing internal conflicts and external threats, including raids by nomadic groups like the Cumans. Novgorod, for example, developed a unique form of governance with a strong merchant class and a vesh, or assembly, that played a significant role in local decision-making. Meanwhile, Vladimir Suzdal, located in the northeastern part of the Kievan Rus, became increasingly powerful and laid the groundwork for the future Grand Duchy of Moscow. The division into principalities was further exacerbated by external pressures, most notably the Mongol invasion in the early 13th century. The Mongol conquest of the Kievan Rus in the 1230s and 1240s led to widespread devastation and further disintegration of centralized power. The principalities were forced to submit to Mongol rule and pay tribute to the Golden Horde, which maintained control over the region for more than 2 centuries. This period of Mongol dominance isolated the principalities from Western Europe, influencing their political development and further entrenching regional divisions. Despite their fragmentation, the principalities maintained cultural and religious ties, largely through the Orthodox Church, which continued to play a unifying role. However, the lack of political unity made the region vulnerable to external threats and internal strife, setting the stage for the eventual rise of Moscow as the center of Russian power in the late medieval period. The fragmentation into principalities was thus a pivotal moment in Russian history, shaping the region's political landscape and influencing the future development of the Russian state. The Mongol invasion of Russia began in the early 13th century and marked a transformative period in Russian history. The invasion was part of the broader Mongol expansion under Genghis Khan and his successors, who sought to conquer vast territories across Eurasia. The initial incursions into Russian lands started in 1223 when Mongol forces led by Subutai and Jebe defeated a coalition of Russian princes and their allies at the Battle of the Kalka River. Although the Mongols withdrew temporarily, this battle was a prelude to the full-scale invasion that followed. The main invasion began in 1237 under the leadership of Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. The Mongols systematically attacked and devastated Russian principalities, using highly mobile cavalry, advanced military tactics, and psychological warfare to instill fear. Major cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kyiv were besieged, sacked, and often completely destroyed. The fall of Kyiv in 1240 was particularly symbolic, as it marked the destruction of one of the most important cultural and political centers of the Kievan Rus. The Mongol invasion was marked by extreme brutality, leading to widespread loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and the displacement of populations. After the initial conquest, Russia fell under the rule of the Mongol Empire, specifically the Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate that controlled vast territories in Eastern Europe, including the Russian principalities. The period of Mongol domination, often referred to as the Mongol Yoke, lasted from the mid-13th century until the late 15th century. The Mongols did not directly administer the Russian territories, but instead allowed local princes to rule their lands as long as they paid tribute and provided military support when required. This indirect rule allowed the Mongols to exert control while maintaining a relatively small administrative presence. Under Mongol rule, Russian principalities were forced to pay heavy tributes, which placed a significant economic burden on the population. The Mongols imposed a tax system that enriched the Golden Horde and maintained their dominance, while Russian princes who collected the tribute gained power and often used Mongol support to settle internal disputes and rivalries. This system of vassalage led to increased power for certain principalities, particularly Moscow, which eventually emerged as a major center of power due to its strategic location and political maneuvering. Mongol rule also had profound cultural and political effects on Russia. It isolated Russia from Western Europe during a critical period of development, contributing to distinct differences in governance, society, and culture. The Mongol influence on Russian military tactics, taxation, and administration was significant, and the experience of subjugation under the Mongols instilled a strong sense of resilience and a desire for independence among the Russian people. Despite the harshness of Mongol rule, the Orthodox Church was allowed to flourish, as the Mongols generally respected religious institutions and even granted the Church certain privileges, which helped it grow in influence and maintain social cohesion. The decline of the Mongol Empire and internal strife within the Golden Horde eventually weakened Mongol control over Russia. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Russian principalities, particularly Moscow, began to assert their independence. This culminated in the victory of the Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, who refused to pay tribute to the Mongols and effectively ended Mongol rule in Russia with a stand on the Ugra River in 1480. The end of Mongol domination set the stage for the rise of Moscow as the center of a unified Russian state, profoundly shaping Russia's future development and identity. The Mongol administrative system had a significant impact on Russia, reshaping its political, economic, and social structures during the period of Mongol rule, often referred to as the Mongol yoke. The Mongols introduced an administrative framework that, while largely indirect, left lasting influences on the way Russian principalities were governed. One of the key effects of the Mongol administrative system was the introduction of a centralized tribute collection process. The Mongols required Russian princes to pay heavy tributes to the Golden Horde, which was enforced through a system of vassalage. Local Russian rulers were allowed to maintain their positions as long as they remained loyal to the Mongols and paid the required taxes. This system not only drained resources from Russian lands but also reinforced the power of certain princes, particularly those who acted as intermediaries between the Mongols and other Russian territories. Over time, this led to the rise of Moscow as a dominant power, as Moscow's princes skillfully managed tribute collection and used their position to expand their influence. The Mongols also implemented census-taking, known as chisk, to accurately assess the population and resources available for taxation. This was a significant administrative innovation in Russia, as it provided the Mongols with detailed information that allowed them to levy taxes more effectively. The census was conducted with the help of local officials, which further integrated Mongol practices into the Russian administrative framework. Mongol rule also influenced Russian military organization and governance. The Mongols imposed military obligations on Russian princes, who were required to provide troops when called upon. This system fostered a more hierarchical and disciplined military structure in Russian principalities, with a strong emphasis on loyalty to the ruling authority, reflecting Mongol practices. Additionally, the Mongol administrative style, characterized by a focus on order, surveillance, and strict control, influenced how Russian rulers later approached governance, emphasizing centralized authority and the subordination of regional powers. The Mongols allowed the Russian Orthodox Church a degree of autonomy, exempting it from taxes and interference. This not only preserved the Church's influence but also allowed it to accumulate wealth and land, which played a crucial role in maintaining social stability and continuity of Russian cultural and religious life during the period of Mongol dominance. Furthermore, the Mongol practice of using written legal codes and bureaucratic record-keeping left a mark on Russian administrative practices. While the Mongols themselves were not heavily involved in day-to-day governance, the emphasis on structured, bureaucratic control influenced the emerging Russian state's approach to administration, contributing to the development of more systematic governance and taxation methods. Overall, the Mongol administrative system profoundly shaped the development of the Russian state. It introduced centralized and hierarchical governance practices, fostered the rise of powerful principalities like Moscow, and indirectly strengthened the role of the Orthodox Church. These influences helped lay the groundwork for the centralized Russian state that would emerge in the late medieval period, with a strong emphasis on autocratic rule and a well-organized administrative structure. The weakening of Mongol rule in Russia and the subsequent strengthening of the Russian principalities were gradual processes that unfolded over several decades, culminating in the end of Mongol hegemony in the late 15th century. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Golden Horde, which had ruled over Russia, began to experience significant internal strife. The Horde faced political fragmentation, with various successor states emerging and competing for dominance. This period of instability was marked by succession disputes, civil wars, and fragmentation within the Mongol Empire, which weakened its control over its distant territories, including Russia. The disintegration of the Golden Horde into smaller khanates, such as the Crimean Khanate and the Kazan Khanate, further eroded the central authority of the Mongol rulers. During this time, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which had been gaining power and influence, played a crucial role in the weakening of Mongol rule. Moscow's princes, particularly Ivan I and Ivan III, were adept at navigating the complex political landscape. Ivan I, also known as Ivan Khalida, used his role as a tax collector for the Mongols to amass wealth and consolidate power. He managed to expand Moscow's territory and influence while maintaining the favor of the Mongol overlords. His successors continued this strategy, leveraging the declining power of the Golden Horde to strengthen Moscow's position. Ivan III, or Ivan the Great, was instrumental in the final push for Russian independence from Mongol rule. By the 1460s, the decline of the Golden Horde had left a power vacuum in Russia, which Ivan III sought to exploit. Ivan III expanded Moscow's territory and authority, gradually asserting control over other Russian principalities and diminishing their reliance on Mongol support. He also engaged in military and diplomatic efforts to challenge the Mongol authority. In 1480, Ivan III faced the Golden Horde's Khan Akhmet in the stand on the Ugra River, a pivotal confrontation that effectively marked the end of Mongol dominance. The battle, which resulted in a standoff, demonstrated the weakening resolve of the Mongol forces and the growing strength of Moscow. Following the stand on the Ugra River, Ivan III refused to pay tribute to the Mongols, solidifying Moscow's independence. The fall of the Golden Horde's central authority and the rise of Moscow as a dominant power led to the eventual collapse of Mongol hegemony in Russia. The successor Khanates, like the Crimean Khanate, continued to exist but were no longer able to exert significant control over Russian territories. The end of Mongol rule marked the beginning of a new era for Russia. With the decline of Mongol influence, Moscow emerged as the central power in Russia, laying the foundation for the centralized Russian state. The period of Mongol dominance had left a lasting impact on Russian governance, military organization, and administrative practices, which continued to influence the development of the Russian state long after the end of Mongol rule. In the 16th century, Russia underwent significant transformation and consolidation, marked by the rise of the centralized Russian state and substantial changes in its political, social, and economic landscape. The century began with the reign of Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, who was crowned as the first Tsar of Russia in 1547. Ivan IV's rule was a period of profound change, characterized by the centralization of power and the expansion of Russian territories. He implemented reforms aimed at strengthening the central authority, including the creation of a more organized administrative system and the establishment of a standing army, known as the Oprichnina, which he used to suppress dissent and consolidate his control. Ivan's reign also saw significant territorial expansion, including the conquest of the Khanate of Kazan in 1552 and the Astrakhan Khanate in 1556, which expanded Russian control over the Volga River basin and opened up new regions for settlement and trade. Ivan IV's later years were marked by increasing paranoia and brutality, leading to a period of instability and turmoil. His Oprichnina, a state within the state led by loyalists, was infamous for its severe repression and the execution of perceived enemies. The death of Ivan's son, Dmitry, under mysterious circumstances in 1591, coupled with the absence of a clear successor, led to a period of crisis known as the Time of Troubles. This era, lasting from the late 16th century into the early 17th century, was characterized by political instability, famine, and foreign intervention, as various claimants to the throne and external forces vied for control of Russia. The Time of Troubles was eventually resolved with the establishment of the Romanov dynasty in 1613, following the election of Michael Romanov as Tsar. The Romanovs would go on to rule Russia for over 3 centuries, beginning a new era of relative stability and consolidation. Michael's reign marked the end of the Time of Troubles and the restoration of order. His administration focused on rebuilding the central authority, recovering lost territories, and addressing the economic and social issues exacerbated by the preceding chaos. The 16th century also saw significant developments in Russian culture and society. The period witnessed the continued spread of orthodoxy, the growth of Russian literature, and the establishment of a more standardized system of written communication. The expansion of trade and exploration contributed to the development of a more cohesive national economy and increased Russia's interactions with Europe and Asia. Overall, the 16th century was a transformative period in Russian history, marked by the centralization of power under the Tsars, significant territorial expansion, and the resolution of internal conflicts. The establishment of the Romanov dynasty set the stage for the further development of the Russian state and its emergence as a major European power in the subsequent centuries. The growth of Moscow and the weakening of Novgorod were key developments in Russian history during the late medieval period, particularly from the 14th to the 16th centuries. Moscow's rise began in earnest during the reign of Ivan I, also known as Ivan Khalida, who ruled from 1325 to 1340. Ivan I was appointed as the Grand Prince of Vladimir by the Mongols, which significantly boosted Moscow's prestige and influence. He skillfully leveraged his position to consolidate power, expand Moscow's territory, and strengthen its economic base. His role as a tax collector for the Mongols, combined with his ability to gather tribute from surrounding lands, allowed him to accumulate wealth and further enhance Moscow's influence. Ivan III, or Ivan the Great, who ruled from 1462 to 1505, was pivotal in Moscow's expansion. Under his leadership, Moscow successfully asserted itself as the center of Russian power, consolidating control over former rival principalities and regions. Ivan III's military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvers, including the defeat of the Novgorod Republic, allowed Moscow to extend its dominance. His reign marked the end of Mongol hegemony, as he refused to pay tribute to the Mongols and successfully challenged their authority. The weakening of Novgorod, which had been one of the most powerful and prosperous principalities in Russia, was a result of both internal and external factors. Novgorod, a major trade and cultural center, had traditionally enjoyed a degree of autonomy and maintained a democratic form of governance with a veche, or popular assembly. However, as Moscow began to rise in prominence, it sought to integrate and control Novgorod. Ivan III's annexation of Novgorod in 1478 was a critical moment in the weakening of the Republic. The conflict between Moscow and Novgorod had been brewing for years, as Moscow aimed to consolidate its control over the northern territories and reduce the influence of Novgorod's independent trading and political practices. The annexation was achieved through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering. Moscow's forces, led by Ivan III, besieged Novgorod and eventually forced its leaders to submit. The city was integrated into the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and its political autonomy was significantly diminished. Following the annexation, Novgorod's economic and political influence waned. The city's trade routes and commercial dominance were absorbed into the expanding Moscow-centered economy. The once powerful veche system was dismantled, and Novgorod's governance was restructured to align with Moscow's centralized authority. The decline of Novgorod marked a significant shift in the balance of power in Russia, as Moscow emerged as the preeminent center of Russian political and cultural life. Overall, the growth of Moscow and the weakening of Novgorod were emblematic of the broader process of consolidation and centralization that characterized the rise of the Russian state. Moscow's strategic, military, and diplomatic efforts enabled it to supplant Novgorod and other rival principalities, setting the stage for the establishment of a unified and centralized Russian state under the leadership of the Tsars. The Battle of Livonia, also known as the Battle of the Ice, was fought on April 5, 1242, and was a significant confrontation between the forces of the Teutonic Order and the Novgorod Republic. It took place on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, which is located on the border between present-day Estonia and Russia. The Teutonic Order, a military and religious order of German knights, sought to expand its influence in the Baltic region and had been engaged in a series of campaigns against the pagan tribes of the area, including the Estonians and Latvians. By the early 13th century, the order had extended its control over much of Livonia, modern-day Latvia and Estonia, and was looking to consolidate its power further into the Novgorod territories. The Novgorod Republic, a powerful city-state in northern Russia, was led by Prince Alexander Nevsky, who was renowned for his military prowess and diplomatic skills. The conflict between the Novgorodians and the Teutonic Order was part of a broader struggle for dominance over the Baltic region and its trade routes. The Battle of the Ice was a decisive conflict that took place during the winter months when Lake Peipus was covered with thick ice. Alexander Nevsky's forces, numbering about 5,000 men, faced the Teutonic Knights and their allies, who were estimated to be around 2,000 to 3,000 strong. The battle was notable not only for its setting on the ice, but also for the tactical acumen displayed by Alexander Nevsky and his commanders. The Novgorodians utilized the harsh winter conditions and the frozen lake to their advantage. They employed a strategy that involved drawing the Teutonic Knights onto the ice, where the frozen surface proved treacherous for the heavily armored knights. The Novgorodian forces engaged the Teutonic Knights in close combat, and the ice eventually began to crack under the weight of the combatants and their horses. As the ice broke, many of the Teutonic Knights and their men fell into the freezing waters or were otherwise defeated. The victory at the Battle of the Ice was a major triumph for Alexander Nevsky and the Novgorod Republic. It effectively halted the expansionist ambitions of the Teutonic Order in the region and secured Novgorod's control over its territories. The battle is remembered as a significant moment in Russian history and is celebrated in Russian folklore and historical accounts. The success of Alexander Nevsky not only bolstered his reputation as a defender of his lands, but also contributed to the strengthening of Novgorod's position in the northern territories of Russia. The battle underscored the importance of strategic advantage and environmental conditions in medieval warfare and had lasting implications for the geopolitical landscape of the Baltic region. Oprichnina was a period of Russian history during the reign of Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, from 1565 to 1572. It was characterized by a series of radical reforms and policies aimed at consolidating the Tsar's power and suppressing dissent within the Russian state. The term Oprichnina refers to both a policy and a special administrative territory that Ivan IV established. The word itself derives from oprich, meaning separate or apart, which reflected the separation of this new system from the traditional governance of the Russian state. Ivan IV divided his realm into two parts, the Oprichnina and the Zemshchina. The Oprichnina was a region directly controlled by Ivan, where he implemented his own policies and exercised his authority without interference from the traditional nobility. The Zemshchina was the remainder of the country, governed by the traditional aristocracy and subject to normal administrative practices. The Oprichnina was characterized by several key features. Creation of the Oprichniki. Ivan IV established a personal guard known as the Oprichniki, composed of loyalists who were granted special privileges. These enforcers were tasked with carrying out the Tsar's orders, particularly in the Oprichnina territories. The Oprichniki were notorious for their brutal methods, including the arrest, torture, and execution of those perceived as enemies or traitors. Repression and purges. The Oprichnina was marked by widespread repression and purges of the nobility and the merchant class. Ivan IV used the Oprichniki to target and eliminate political rivals, suspected conspirators, and those who opposed his rule. This period saw the execution of thousands of people, including prominent nobles and their families. The infamous massacre of Novgorod in 1570 was one of the most notorious events, where many residents of Novgorod were killed or tortured by the Oprichniki. Economic and administrative changes. The establishment of the Oprichnina disrupted traditional economic and administrative structures. The Oprichniki seized land and property from the nobility, redistributing it to Ivan's loyalists. This undermined the power of the traditional aristocracy and altered the economic landscape of Russia. Impact on Russian society. The Oprichnina period had a profound impact on Russian society, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The brutality of the Oprichniki and the arbitrary nature of Ivan IV's rule led to widespread unrest and instability. The period contributed to the growing centralization of the Tsar's power, but also left a legacy of terror and repression. By 1572, Ivan IV abolished the Oprichnina in response to mounting internal problems and the strain it had placed on the Russian state. The dissolution of the Oprichnina marked the end of this particularly harsh period of Ivan IV's reign, but its effects on Russian governance and society persisted. The legacy of the Oprichnina contributed to the reputation of Ivan IV as a tyrant and influenced the subsequent development of Russian autocracy. In the 17th century, the Tsardom of Moscow, which evolved into the Russian Empire by the century's end, underwent significant transformations in its political, social, and economic structures. This period was marked by the consolidation of autocratic rule, internal strife, and the beginning of modernization efforts. The century began with the Romanov dynasty, which had been established in 1613 after the end of the Time of Troubles, a period of political instability and foreign intervention. Michael Romanov, the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty, began the process of stabilizing and rebuilding the Russian state. His reign, lasting from 1613 to 1645, focused on restoring order, consolidating power, and re-establishing the authority of the central government. Michael's son, Alexis I, who ruled from 1645 to 1676, continued these efforts and made significant contributions to the development of the Tsardom. His reign was marked by internal reforms aimed at centralizing the administration and strengthening the power of the Tsar. One of his major initiatives was the creation of a new code of laws, known as the Sobornoye Ulazny, the Code of Laws of 1649, which codified existing laws and established a more uniform legal system. This code also reinforced the system of serfdom, tying peasants to the land and increasing the control of landowners over their serfs. The 17th century also saw significant social and political upheaval, including the rise of the Old Believer Schism. The Old Believers were a group of Russian Orthodox Christians who rejected the church reforms introduced by Patriarch Nikon in the 1650s. Nikon's reforms aimed to bring Russian church practices in line with those of the Greek Orthodox Church, but were met with strong resistance from traditionalists. This schism led to a series of persecutions and conflicts, further straining the relationship between the state and religious groups. The latter part of the 17th century was characterized by the reign of Tsar Peter I, also known as Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725. Peter's reign marked a period of profound transformation and modernization for Russia. He sought to transform Russia into a major European power by implementing sweeping reforms across various aspects of Russian life. Peter restructured the government, creating a more bureaucratic and centralized administration. He also modernized the military, incorporating Western technology and tactics, which greatly enhanced Russia's military capabilities. Peter's efforts to modernize Russia extended to social reforms, including changes in dress, customs, and social hierarchies. He encouraged the development of industry and commerce, and founded the city of St. Petersburg in 1703, which he envisioned as a new capital that would serve as a gateway to Europe and a symbol of Russia's modernization. Peter's reign also involved significant military campaigns, including the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, against Sweden. This conflict was pivotal in securing Russia's position as a major European power and expanding its territories. The war concluded with the Treaty of Nystad in 1721, which granted Russia significant territories and marked its emergence as a major player in European politics. By the end of the 17th century, the Tsardom of Moscow had undergone substantial changes, transitioning from a relatively isolated and traditional state into a burgeoning empire with ambitions of European integration. The reforms and policies of Tsar Peter the Great were instrumental in shaping the future trajectory of Russia, setting the stage for its transformation into a major empire in the 18th century. The 17th century in Russia was a period marked by significant social, economic, and political upheaval, often referred to as the Russian Depression or the Time of Troubles. This era, which lasted roughly from the late 16th century into the early 17th century, was characterized by severe internal strife, economic hardship, and political instability. The Time of Troubles began after the death of Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in 1584, whose passing left a power vacuum and triggered a series of crises. The immediate aftermath saw a succession of weak and ineffective rulers, including Ivan IV's son, Fifer I, whose death in 1598 led to the end of the Rurik dynasty. The interregnum that followed saw various claimants to the throne, foreign interventions, and widespread chaos. One of the major issues during this period was the widespread social unrest and economic decline. The collapse of central authority led to a breakdown in law and order, and many regions experienced banditry, violence, and instability. The economy suffered due to disrupted trade, decreased agricultural productivity, and the general collapse of administrative structures. The period was also marked by famine and plague, which compounded the suffering of the population. Poor harvests and inadequate response to these crises led to severe food shortages and high mortality rates. The population's hardships were exacerbated by the ongoing conflicts and the lack of effective governance. The Time of Troubles also saw significant political and military conflicts. Various pretenders to the throne, known as false Dimitris, emerged and garnered support from different factions and foreign powers, further destabilizing the country. The involvement of foreign powers, including Poland and Sweden, who sought to exploit Russia's internal chaos, added to the complexity of the situation. The eventual end of the Time of Troubles came with the election of Michael Romanov as Tsar in 1613. Michael, from the Romanov family, was chosen as a unifying figure who could restore stability and order to the Russian state. His election marked the beginning of the Romanov dynasty and a gradual recovery from the period of turmoil. Under the early Romanovs, Russia began to stabilize and recover from the deep crises of the 17th century. Michael Romanov and his successors worked to restore central authority, rebuild the economy, and re-establish social order. However, the scars of the Time of Troubles left a lasting impact on Russian society and politics, influencing the course of Russian history for years to come. The Romanov dynasty, which ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917, was one of the longest-reigning dynasties in Russian history and played a crucial role in shaping the modern Russian state. The dynasty was founded by Michael Romanov, who was elected Tsar in 1613 after the tumultuous Time of Troubles, a period of political instability and foreign intervention. Michael Romanov's election marked the beginning of a new era of relative stability and consolidation for Russia. His reign, which lasted until 1645, focused on restoring order, re-establishing central authority, and addressing the aftermath of the time of troubles. His efforts laid the groundwork for the dynasty's long-lasting influence over Russian politics. Under Michael's son, Alexis I, who ruled from 1645 to 1676, the Romanovs continued to strengthen their grip on power. Alexis implemented significant legal reforms with the creation of the Sobornoye Ulazany Code of Laws of 1649, which codified laws and reinforced the system of serfdom. His reign was also marked by internal strife, including the Old Believers' Schism, which arose from resistance to church reforms. The Romanov dynasty saw a significant transformation under Peter I, known as Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725. Peter's reign was a period of radical modernization and reform. He sought to transform Russia into a major European power by overhauling the military, administration, and society. Peter's reforms included creating a modern navy, restructuring the government, and founding the city of St. Petersburg, which became the new capital of Russia. His efforts to modernize Russia were instrumental in its emergence as a major European state. Peter's successors continued his policies of modernization and expansion. His wife, Catherine I, and later his granddaughter, Elizabeth, ruled during periods of relative stability. Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, who reigned from 1762 to 1796, is particularly notable for her efforts to continue modernization, expand Russian territories, and support the arts and education. Her reign is often seen as a golden age of the Russian Empire, marked by significant cultural and intellectual achievements. The 19th century saw the Romanovs navigate through various challenges, including internal reforms, social unrest, and increasing demands for political change. Tsar Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, faced significant political and military challenges, including the Decembrist Revolt and the Crimean War. His successor, Alexander II, is remembered for his major reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, which aimed to modernize Russian society and economy. The final years of the Romanov dynasty were marked by increasing turmoil and discontent. Tsar Nicholas II, who ruled from 1894 to 1917, faced growing political unrest, social unrest, and revolutionary movements. The pressures of World War I, combined with domestic issues, led to widespread dissatisfaction and the eventual abdication of Nicholas II in 1917. The February Revolution of 1917 resulted in the end of the Romanov rule and the establishment of a provisional government, which was later replaced by the Bolshevik regime in October 1917. Following the abdication, Nicholas II and his family were placed under house arrest and eventually executed by Bolsheviks in 1918. The fall of the Romanov dynasty marked the end of Imperial Russia and the beginning of the Soviet era. The Romanovs' legacy remains a complex and significant part of Russian history, reflecting the transformation of Russia from a medieval state to a major empire. The 17th century in Russia was marked by a significant religious crisis that had profound implications for Russian society and the Russian Orthodox Church. This crisis was primarily driven by a series of church reforms and the resulting schism that divided the Orthodox community. The crisis began during the reign of Tsar Alexis I, who sought to reform the Russian Orthodox Church to bring its practices into closer alignment with those of the Greek Orthodox Church. This reform effort was spearheaded by Patriarch Nikon, who was appointed as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1652. Nikon's reforms aimed to standardize church rituals and practices, which had diverged from the Greek Orthodox traditions over centuries of isolation. One of the major reforms included changes in the way religious texts were written, the use of church liturgy, and the practice of certain rituals. For example, Nikon introduced changes in the spelling of religious words and the number of fingers used in making the sign of the cross, which were intended to align Russian practices with Greek Orthodox standards. These reforms were controversial and met with resistance from many traditionalists within the church and the broader population. The resistance to Nikon's reforms led to the emergence of a schism within the Russian Orthodox Church. The traditionalists, known as the Old Believers or Old Ritualists, rejected the new practices and refused to accept the authority of the Reformed Church. They believed that the changes compromised the purity of the Orthodox faith and adhered to the old rituals and practices. The Old Believers maintained their own churches and communities, often facing persecution and suppression by the state. The conflict between the Reformists and the Old Believers escalated into a series of violent confrontations and repressive measures. The state, under Tsar Alexis I and his successors, sought to enforce Nikon's reforms and suppress dissent. This led to the persecution of Old Believers, who were subjected to fines, imprisonment, and even execution. The repression also included the destruction of Old Believer churches and the confiscation of their property. The religious crisis had far-reaching effects on Russian society. It contributed to a deepening divide within the Orthodox community, leading to a legacy of religious and cultural conflict. The Old Believers preserved their traditions and beliefs despite ongoing persecution and continued to play a significant role in Russian religious life. The crisis also had implications for the relationship between church and state. The efforts to reform and control the church highlighted the growing influence of the Russian state over religious matters and the extent to which religious authority was intertwined with political power. Overall, the 17th century religious crisis in Russia was a complex and tumultuous period marked by significant changes in church practices, intense religious conflict, and state repression. The schism between the Old Believers and the Reformed Orthodox Church left a lasting impact on Russian religious and cultural history. In the 18th century, the Russian Empire underwent a period of profound transformation and expansion under the leadership of several significant rulers. This era was marked by extensive reforms, territorial expansion, and the consolidation of Russia as a major European power. The century began with Peter the Great, who reigned from 1682 to 1725. Peter's rule was a turning point in Russian history as he embarked on a comprehensive program of modernization and westernization. His reforms touched on various aspects of Russian life, including the military, government, and society. Peter reorganized the army and navy, established new administrative institutions, and introduced European-style bureaucratic practices. He also founded the city of St. Petersburg in 1703, which he envisioned as a modern, European-style capital and a gateway to the West. Peter's efforts were instrumental in transforming Russia from a relatively isolated and traditional state into a major European power. Peter's reign included significant military campaigns, notably the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, against Sweden. This conflict was crucial in establishing Russia as a dominant power in the Baltic region. The Treaty of Nystad, signed in 1721, secured Russia's gains from the war and marked the end of Swedish dominance in the area. The successful outcome of the war significantly enhanced Russia's strategic and economic position. Peter's successors continued his reforms and expansionist policies. His wife, Catherine I, and subsequent rulers, including Peter II, Anna Ivanovna, and Elizabeth, managed various aspects of the empire's administration and foreign policy. Catherine I, who ruled from 1725 to 1727, continued Peter's policies but with less impact. Her successor, Peter II, was a young and inexperienced ruler whose reign was marked by political instability. Anna Ivanovna, 1730 to 1740, and Elizabeth, 1741 to 1762, furthered the process of westernization and consolidation. Elizabeth, in particular, is remembered for her patronage of the arts and education. Her reign saw the continued expansion of Russian influence in Europe and the establishment of St. Petersburg as a major cultural and intellectual center. The latter part of the century was defined by the rule of Catherine the Great, Catherine II, who reigned from 1762 to 1796. Catherine was a highly influential ruler known for her efforts to continue Peter the Great's reforms and expand Russian territories. She embraced Enlightenment ideas and sought to modernize Russian governance, culture, and education. Catherine's reign was marked by significant territorial expansion, including the successful wars against the Ottoman Empire and the partitions of Poland, which resulted in substantial territorial gains for Russia. Catherine also focused on internal reforms, including efforts to improve the legal system and promote the arts and sciences. Her reign is often regarded as a golden age of Russian culture, with significant contributions to literature, art, and intellectual thought. By the end of the 18th century, the Russian Empire had firmly established itself as a major European power with a significant influence on the continent's political, economic, and cultural landscape. The reforms and territorial expansions of the century set the stage for the continued growth and development of the empire into the 19th century. The 18th century was a formative period that reshaped Russia's place in the world and laid the groundwork for its future as a powerful empire. Peter the Great, who reigned from 1682 to 1725, was one of the most transformative figures in Russian history. His reign marked a period of extensive reform and modernization, aimed at transforming Russia into a major European power. Peter's rule is often seen as a turning point in Russian history, as he sought to overhaul virtually every aspect of Russian society, government, and military to align more closely with Western European standards. Peter the Great's reign was characterized by a series of sweeping reforms across various domains. Military reforms. Peter undertook major efforts to modernize the Russian military. He reorganized the army along Western lines, introducing new tactics, training methods, and equipment. He established a modern navy, which included the creation of a naval base at St. Petersburg. The development of the navy was crucial for Russia's expansion and its ability to project power in the Baltic Sea and beyond. Administrative reforms. Peter restructured the Russian government to enhance central control and efficiency. He introduced a new administrative system with a series of colleges or departments responsible for different aspects of governance, such as foreign affairs, war, and justice. He also established a Senate to oversee the administration and implemented a table of ranks, which created a merit-based system for official appointments. Economic reforms. Peter promoted industrialization and economic development. He encouraged the growth of manufacturing and the establishment of new industries, including shipbuilding, textiles, and mining. His efforts to modernize the economy were aimed at reducing Russia's dependence on foreign goods and increasing its economic self-sufficiency. Cultural and social reforms. Peter sought to bring Russian culture and society in line with Western European norms. He introduced new laws governing social behavior, including reforms related to dress and personal appearance. He also promoted education and the development of science and technology, establishing institutions such as the Academy of Sciences. Capital relocation. One of Peter's most significant achievements was the founding of St. Petersburg in 1703. He envisioned it as a modern, European-style city that would serve as Russia's new capital and a symbol of the country's transformation. St. Petersburg became a major cultural and political center, reflecting Peter's vision for Russia's integration with Europe. Peter the Great's foreign policy was equally ambitious and aimed at establishing Russia as a dominant European power. Great Northern War. Peter's most notable foreign policy initiative was the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, against Sweden. Peter sought to gain access to the Baltic Sea and challenge Sweden's dominance in the region. The war involved several European powers and was marked by significant battles, including the Battle of Poltava in 1709, where Peter's forces achieved a decisive victory. The Treaty of Nystad, 1721, concluded the war, resulting in Russia gaining significant territories, including Estonia, Livonia, and parts of Finland, thereby establishing its presence in the Baltic Sea. Expansion into the Black Sea. Peter also pursued policies aimed at expanding Russian influence in the Black Sea region. He engaged in wars with the Ottoman Empire to secure access to the Black Sea, but his efforts met with mixed success. Although he made some gains, including the Treaty of Pruth in 1711, Russia did not fully achieve its objectives in this area during Peter's reign. Diplomatic maneuvering. Peter engaged in extensive diplomatic efforts to align Russia with various European powers and secure advantageous alliances. He established relations with countries such as France, Britain, and Austria to bolster Russia's position and support its military and economic goals. Overall, Peter the Great's reign was a period of profound change and modernization for Russia. His reforms and foreign policy efforts significantly altered the course of Russian history, laying the foundations for Russia's emergence as a major European power in the 18th century. His legacy is marked by the transformation of Russia into a more modern, centralized, and influential state. During the reign of Peter the Great, several forms of opposition emerged in response to his sweeping reforms and modernization efforts. This opposition came from various segments of Russian society, including the traditional nobility, the Orthodox Church, and segments of the populace resistant to change. Nobility. One of the primary sources of opposition came from the Russian nobility, or the boyars, who were resistant to Peter's centralizing reforms. Peter's efforts to reduce the power of the traditional aristocracy and to establish a merit-based system for appointments often clashed with the interests of the boyars. The table of ranks, which replaced the traditional hereditary aristocracy with a system based on merit and service, was particularly unpopular among the nobility. The boyars felt threatened by the erosion of their traditional privileges and status. Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church was another major source of opposition. Peter's reforms aimed to bring the Church in line with Western practices and reduce its political influence. The establishment of the Holy Synod, which replaced the Patriarchate and placed church administration under state control, was particularly contentious. Patriarch Nikon's earlier reforms had already caused significant division within the Church, and Peter's further changes exacerbated tensions. The Church's traditionalists, including some clergy and monks, opposed these efforts and resisted the new regulations imposed by Peter. Old Believers. The Old Believers, who had resisted the church reforms initiated by Patriarch Nikon in the mid-17th century, were particularly opposed to Peter's attempts to further modernize and standardize religious practices. The Old Believers adhered to traditional rites and refused to accept the changes introduced by the state church. This group faced persecution and repression under Peter's rule, which included imprisonment, exile, and the destruction of their places of worship. Public resistance. The broader populace also exhibited resistance to Peter's reforms, particularly in rural areas. The imposition of new taxes, labor requirements, and administrative changes led to discontent among peasants and lower classes. Peter's efforts to enforce conscription and his harsh measures to increase state revenues through reforms like the poll tax led to various uprisings and protests. Military rebellion. There were also instances of military opposition. Notably, the Streltsy, an elite military unit that had been a powerful force under previous Tsars, rebelled against Peter's reforms. The Streltsy were unhappy with Peter's efforts to reorganize and modernize the military, which included reducing their power and influence. The most significant Streltsy rebellion occurred in 1698, resulting in the execution of many rebels and the disbandment of the unit. Personal enemies and court intrigues. Peter also faced opposition from within his own court and among his personal associates. Some of his closest advisors and family members were discontent with his autocratic style and the pace of his reforms. This included various factions within the court who vied for power and influence, often at odds with Peter's policies. Despite the opposition, Peter the Great's reforms largely succeeded in transforming Russian society, military, and government. His ability to suppress and manage dissent, combined with his determination and strategic vision, allowed him to implement his ambitious agenda and establish Russia as a major European power. After the death of Peter the Great in 1725, Russia experienced a period of significant political instability and transition. Peter's death left a power vacuum and initiated a series of changes in leadership and policy, leading to both continuity and upheaval in the Russian Empire. Succession and regency. Peter's death led to the accession of his wife, Catherine I, who ruled from 1725 to 1727. Catherine's reign was marked by her reliance on Peter's existing advisors and the continuation of his policies, but she lacked the same level of authority and reformative zeal. Her rule was relatively short and was primarily characterized by internal court politics and intrigue, power struggles and political instability. Following Catherine I's death in 1727, Russia experienced a period of political instability marked by a series of brief and unstable reigns. Peter II, Peter the Great's teenage grandson, succeeded Catherine but died young in 1730, leading to further uncertainty. The period was marked by frequent changes in leadership and the influence of powerful factions within the court. The era of the empresses. The early 18th century saw a succession of empresses who played a crucial role in shaping the empire. Anna Ivanovna, 1730 to 1740, and Elizabeth, 1741 to 1762, were two key figures during this period. Anna Ivanovna's reign was marked by a return to more traditional autocratic rule and continued centralization. Her rule was characterized by the consolidation of power and the strengthening of the government's control over the provinces. Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter, became empress in 1741, and her reign is often seen as a period of relative stability and cultural flourishing. She continued many of her father's policies, including the promotion of the arts and the expansion of Russia's influence. Elizabeth also played a significant role in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which was a major conflict involving many European powers, including Russia. Her reign is noted for the continuation of Peter's reforms and the growth of St. Petersburg as a cultural and political center. The rise of Catherine the Great. In 1762, Elizabeth's death led to the brief reign of Peter III, who was overthrown by a coup led by his wife, Catherine the Great, Catherine II. Catherine's accession marked the beginning of a significant and transformative period in Russian history. Her reign, lasting from 1762 to 1796, is often considered a golden age of the Russian Empire. Catherine continued to build on Peter's reforms, promoting modernization and westernization, and expanding Russian territory through successful military campaigns. Reforms and modernization. Catherine the Great furthered the modernization efforts initiated by Peter the Great. She implemented administrative reforms, promoted education and cultural development, and continued to encourage the growth of the Russian economy. Catherine also focused on expanding Russia's influence through territorial acquisitions, including successful wars against the Ottoman Empire and the partitions of Poland. Overall, the period following Peter the Great's death was one of transition and adjustment. While there was political instability and uncertainty, the subsequent rulers, particularly Catherine the Great, built upon Peter's reforms and continued to shape Russia into a major European power. The reforms and policies initiated during Peter's reign laid the foundation for Russia's continued development and influence in the centuries to follow. Empress Anna Ivanovna, who ruled Russia from 1730 to 1740, was a significant figure in the early 18th century Russian Empire. She was the daughter of Tsar Ivan V and the niece of Peter the Great. Her reign followed a period of instability and was marked by efforts to consolidate power and strengthen autocratic rule. Anna's accession to the throne came after the death of her predecessor, Peter II, and a period of political maneuvering involving various factions within the Russian court. Upon her ascension, she initially relied on the support of the influential court faction led by her German-born favorite, Ernst Johann von Biron, who played a key role in her administration. Anna's rule was characterized by a return to more traditional forms of autocratic governance, moving away from some of the reforms and administrative changes implemented by Peter the Great. She focused on strengthening central authority and maintaining stability within the empire. Her reign saw the consolidation of power in the hands of the monarchy and a reduction in the influence of the nobility. One of the notable aspects of Anna's rule was her engagement in internal and external politics. She continued Russia's involvement in European affairs, including the War of the Polish Succession, 1733 to 1738, which was part of a broader struggle among European powers for influence in Poland. The war, which ended in a favorable outcome for Russia, helped solidify Russia's position in European politics. Anna's reign also saw efforts to centralize administration and strengthen the state apparatus. She undertook measures to improve the efficiency of government institutions and reinforced the role of the bureaucracy. However, her reign was also marked by political intrigue and the manipulation of court factions, particularly involving her favorite, Biron. In 1740, Anna Ivanovna died, and her death led to a succession crisis. Her infant nephew, Ivan VI, was declared emperor, but the regency was quickly contested. Anna's death ended a relatively stable period in Russian history, but her efforts to consolidate autocratic power and stabilize the empire set the stage for the subsequent reign of Elizabeth and the continued development of the Russian state. In the 18th century, Russia's policies in the Far East and Middle East were driven by its ambitions for territorial expansion, strategic positioning, and economic interests. These policies played a crucial role in shaping Russia's geopolitical landscape and its interactions with neighboring powers. In the Far East, Russia focused on expanding its influence and control over vast and relatively unexplored territories. The early 18th century saw the continuation of efforts to secure and consolidate Russian interests in Siberia and the Pacific region. Peter the Great laid the groundwork for this expansion by initiating the exploration and colonization of Siberia, and his successors built upon these efforts. During the 18th century, Russia continued its exploration and settlement of Siberia, moving further eastward towards the Pacific Ocean. The establishment of forts, trading posts, and settlements along the Amur River and the Pacific coast was a key part of Russia's strategy to control these regions and secure trade routes. The annexation of the Amur region, which involved negotiations and conflicts with neighboring states such as China, was a significant achievement for Russia in this period. Russian policy in the Far East also involved dealing with various indigenous peoples and managing the challenges of integrating these territories into the Russian Empire. This included addressing local resistance, establishing administrative structures, and promoting Russian trade and economic interests in the region. In the Middle East, Russia's policies were shaped by its desire to expand its influence and challenge the dominance of the Ottoman Empire and other regional powers. Throughout the 18th century, Russia pursued a policy of active involvement in Middle Eastern affairs, seeking to gain control over strategic territories and expand its influence in the region. A major focus of Russian policy in the Middle East was the competition with the Ottoman Empire. Russia engaged in several wars with the Ottomans, aiming to gain territory and enhance its strategic position. Notable conflicts include the Russo-Turkish Wars, which were fought over control of territories in the Black Sea region and the Balkans. These wars often resulted in significant territorial gains for Russia and increased its influence in the region. Russia's involvement in the Middle East also included efforts to establish diplomatic and commercial relations with various states and empires. The Russian Empire sought to expand its trade networks and secure access to key resources and markets in the Middle East. This involved negotiations and treaties with regional powers, including Persia, modern-day Iran, which was another significant player in the region. Overall, Russia's policies in the Far East and Middle East during the 18th century were driven by a combination of strategic, economic, and geopolitical considerations. The expansion into Siberia and the Pacific laid the foundation for Russia's dominance in the Far East, while its engagement with the Ottoman Empire and other regional powers in the Middle East established Russia as a significant player in Eurasian politics. In the 18th century, Russia's involvement in Polish and Black Sea affairs was crucial in shaping the region's political landscape and Russia's position as a major European power. Polish issues. Russia's role in Polish affairs during the 18th century was marked by significant intervention and influence. The Kingdom of Poland faced internal instability and external pressures, which created opportunities for Russia to assert its influence. The partitions of Poland. The most significant event in Polish affairs was the series of partitions that resulted in the dissolution of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The first partition occurred in 1772, followed by the second in 1793 and the third in 1795. These partitions were carried out by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, with Russia playing a central role. The partitions effectively eliminated Poland as an independent state and divided its territory among the three powers. First partition, 1772. This partition was driven by internal strife within Poland, including political corruption and instability. Russia, along with Prussia and Austria, took advantage of Poland's weakened state to annex large portions of its territory. Russia gained control over parts of eastern Poland and Lithuania. Second partition, 1793. Following a failed Polish uprising known as the Kosciuszko Uprising, Russia and Prussia agreed to a second partition. Russia acquired more territory in central Poland, further diminishing Polish sovereignty. Third partition, 1795. The final partition occurred after the suppression of the Kosciuszko Uprising and additional unrest in Poland. Russia, Prussia, and Austria completed the division of Polish territory, resulting in the complete dissolution of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia gained control over most of the remaining Polish lands. Polish uprisings. Throughout the 18th century, there were several uprisings against foreign rule, including the Confederation of Bar, 1768 to 1772, and the Kosciuszko Uprising, 1794. These uprisings were driven by Polish nationalist sentiments and resistance to foreign domination. Russia responded with military force to suppress these revolts and solidify its control over Polish territories. Black Sea issues. The Black Sea was a significant area of strategic and economic interest for Russia in the 18th century. The region was the focus of ongoing conflicts with the Ottoman Empire and efforts to secure control over crucial maritime routes. Russo-Turkish Wars. Throughout the 18th century, Russia engaged in several Russo-Turkish wars with the Ottoman Empire. These wars were driven by Russia's desire to expand its influence and gain control over territories around the Black Sea. Russo-Turkish War, 1735 to 1739. This conflict resulted in Russia gaining some concessions from the Ottoman Empire, although it did not achieve significant territorial gains. The Treaty of Niš in 1739 ended the war with Russia obtaining limited territorial and diplomatic concessions. Russo-Turkish War, 1768 to 1774. This war was part of Russia's broader strategy to expand its influence in the Black Sea region. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Kukuk-Kanarka in 1774, which granted Russia significant territorial and diplomatic advantages. Russia gained control over the northern coast of the Black Sea, including parts of the Crimea, and secured rights to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. Russo-Turkish War, 1787 to 1792. The final major conflict of the century with the Ottoman Empire resulted in further Russian gains. The Treaty of Jassy in 1792 solidified Russian control over the Black Sea coast, including the Crimean Peninsula, and established the Dniester River as the boundary between Russian and Ottoman territories. Expansion and naval power. Russia's efforts to gain control of the Black Sea were closely tied to its broader ambitions to establish a strong naval presence in the region. The construction of a modern navy and the establishment of naval bases along the Black Sea coast were key components of Russia's strategy to enhance its maritime power and secure its southern frontier. In summary, Russia's involvement in Polish and Black Sea issues during the 18th century was characterized by aggressive expansionism and strategic maneuvering. The partitioning of Poland eliminated it as an independent state and integrated its territory into the Russian Empire, while Russia's conflicts with the Ottoman Empire and expansion in the Black Sea region reinforced its status as a major European power. Catherine the Great, who reigned from 1762 to 1796, is known for her extensive domestic reforms and efforts to modernize the Russian Empire. Her domestic policies were aimed at consolidating her power, reforming the administration, and promoting cultural and intellectual advancement. Here are some key aspects of her domestic politics. Administrative reforms. Catherine sought to improve the efficiency and organization of the Russian government. She restructured the administrative divisions of the empire, creating new provincial and district boundaries to better manage local governance. Her reforms aimed to streamline administration and reduce corruption, though the effectiveness of these changes varied. Legal reforms. Catherine worked on reforming the Russian legal system. In 1767, she convened a legislative commission to draft a new legal code, known as the Nakaz instruction. The Nakaz proposed a set of principles based on Enlightenment ideas, advocating for the rule of law, equality before the law, and the abolition of torture. However, the Nakaz was never fully implemented, and the existing legal system continued to operate with modifications. Nobility and serfdom. Catherine's relationship with the Russian nobility was complex. She sought to gain their support by granting them increased privileges and autonomy. The Charter to the Nobility, 1785, formalized these privileges, granting the nobility greater control over their estates and local governance. Despite her efforts to reform serfdom, the institution remained largely intact. Catherine's policies often reinforced the power of the nobility over their serfs, leading to criticisms from Enlightenment thinkers who hoped for greater reforms in this area. Educational and cultural advancements. Catherine the Great was a patron of the arts and education. She established several institutions aimed at promoting education and culture. In 1782, she founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls, which was one of the first educational institutions for women in Russia. Catherine also supported the creation of the Russian Academy of Sciences and the development of Russian literature and arts. Her reign saw a flourishing of intellectual and cultural activities, with notable figures such as the writer Denis Diderot and the philosopher Voltaire engaging with Catherine. Economic reforms. Catherine sought to stimulate economic development and modernization. Her reign saw efforts to improve infrastructure, including the construction of roads, ports, and other public works. She also encouraged the development of trade and industry, aiming to enhance Russia's economic position within Europe. Catherine's policies aimed at integrating the empire into the broader European economic system, promoting agricultural and industrial growth. Expansion and territorial policies. Catherine's domestic policies were closely linked to her expansionist ambitions. She pursued a policy of territorial expansion, which included successful military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and the partition of Poland. The expansion of Russian territories was intended to increase the empire's resources and influence, which in turn supported her domestic reforms and consolidation of power. Repression and control. Despite her reformist tendencies, Catherine maintained a firm grip on political power. She dealt with various uprisings and revolts, including the Pugachev Rebellion, 1773 to 1775, which was led by the Cossack leader Yemelian Pugachev and challenged her authority. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and Catherine used the opportunity to tighten her control over the provinces and reinforce the autocratic nature of her rule. In summary, Catherine the Great's domestic politics were characterized by efforts to modernize and reform various aspects of Russian society and governance. Her policies aimed at strengthening central authority, promoting education and culture, and stimulating economic development. While she made significant strides in some areas, her reforms were often limited by the existing social and political structures, and her reign continued to reinforce the autocratic nature of the Russian monarchy. In the 19th century, Russia underwent significant transformations that shaped its political, social, and economic landscape. The century was marked by a series of reforms, wars, and internal challenges that influenced the course of Russian history. At the beginning of the century, Russia was an autocratic state under Tsar Alexander I. His reign was characterized by the influence of Napoleonic Wars, during which Russia played a pivotal role in defeating Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna, 1815, and subsequent treaties redefined European boundaries, with Russia emerging as a major power in Europe. However, the Napoleonic Wars also left Russia with financial strain and a growing awareness of the need for reform. Alexander I's successors, including Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, continued the autocratic tradition but faced growing internal pressures. Nicholas I's reign was marked by a conservative approach and an emphasis on maintaining the existing order. His policies included the suppression of dissent and the use of secret police to control revolutionary activities. The Decembrist Revolt of 1825, led by a group of military officers advocating for constitutional reform, was swiftly crushed, highlighting the regime's intolerance for challenges to its authority. The mid-19th century saw the rise of significant reform efforts under Tsar Alexander II, 1855 to 1881. Alexander II is best known for his emancipation of the serfs in 1861, a major social reform aimed at addressing the agrarian and economic issues of the time. The Emancipation Act was intended to modernize the Russian economy and integrate the serfs into a market economy. Alongside serf emancipation, Alexander II introduced judicial reforms, including the establishment of a more independent judiciary and the introduction of trial by jury. However, the reforms of Alexander II were met with mixed results. While they aimed at modernization, they often fell short of addressing the deeper social and economic issues facing Russia. The dissatisfaction with the pace and scope of reforms, combined with continued economic hardship, led to increased revolutionary activity. The growth of radical movements and the rise of figures like the People's Will, which sought to overthrow the autocracy, culminated in the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. The assassination marked the beginning of a more conservative and repressive era under Alexander III, 1881 to 1894. Alexander III sought to restore autocratic control and suppress revolutionary movements. His policies included the promotion of Russian nationalism and orthodoxy, as well as increased repression of political dissidents. The period was marked by significant industrial growth and modernization, including the expansion of the railway network and the development of heavy industry. The turn of the century brought new challenges and changes. Nicholas II, who reigned from 1894 to 1917, faced mounting internal tensions and external pressures. The early 20th century was characterized by social unrest, including strikes, protests, and the rise of political movements advocating for democratic reforms. The 1905 revolution was a pivotal event that led to the establishment of the Duma, a legislative assembly with limited powers, and the introduction of some political reforms, though autocratic control remained intact. The 19th century also saw Russia's involvement in several major conflicts. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was a significant military and diplomatic challenge for Russia, exposing weaknesses in its military and administrative systems. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, which imposed restrictions on Russia's Black Sea Fleet and highlighted the need for reform. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, was another significant conflict that further exposed Russia's military and administrative shortcomings. The defeat in this war contributed to domestic unrest and dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime. In summary, 19th-century Russia was a period of significant change, marked by efforts at modernization and reform, but also by internal strife and conservative reactions. The century laid the groundwork for the major upheavals of the early 20th century, including the 1917 revolutions that ultimately led to the collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Soviet Union. In the 19th century, the power of the Orthodox Church in Russia experienced a notable decline due to a combination of governmental policies, social changes, and the influence of Enlightenment ideas. The decline was gradual and reflected broader trends of modernization and reform within the Russian Empire. One of the significant factors contributing to the decline of the Orthodox Church's power was the series of reforms introduced by Tsar Alexander II. His reign, which began in 1855, was marked by efforts to modernize and liberalize various aspects of Russian society. Although Alexander II's reforms primarily focused on issues such as serfdom and legal systems, they also impacted the church. The administrative reforms, including the restructuring of local governance and the reduction of the church's influence over secular affairs, diminished its traditional authority. The church's decline was also a result of the increased secularization of Russian society. The spread of Enlightenment ideas, which emphasized reason, science, and secular governance, challenged the church's dominance over intellectual and cultural life. These ideas began to gain traction among the educated elite and were reflected in the growing influence of secular institutions. The late 19th century saw increased government efforts to control and regulate the Orthodox Church. The state sought to limit the church's role in public and political life, particularly as Russia faced various social and political challenges. This included greater state control over church finances, the appointment of bishops, and the management of church properties. By placing these aspects under state control, the government effectively reduced the church's independence and influence. The rise of revolutionary and radical movements, which were often critical of the church's conservative stance and its close relationship with the autocratic regime, further contributed to the decline. These movements, including those advocating for social reform and political change, challenged the Church's role as a pillar of the status quo. The decline of the Orthodox Church's power was also evident in the growing criticism and scrutiny it faced from various quarters of Russian society. Intellectuals, reformers, and political activists increasingly questioned the Church's authority and its role in perpetuating social inequality and autocratic rule. In summary, the decline of the Orthodox Church's power in 19th-century Russia was a complex process influenced by government reforms, the rise of secular and Enlightenment ideas, increased state control, and the challenges posed by revolutionary movements. These factors collectively weakened the Church's influence and marked a significant shift in the relationship between religion and state in Russia. Emperor Pavel I, who reigned from 1796 to 1801, was a significant figure in Russian history whose rule was characterized by dramatic changes in domestic policies, military reforms, and a strained relationship with both the nobility and foreign powers. Pavel I ascended to the throne following the death of his mother, Catherine the Great. His reign was marked by a series of reforms and changes that reflected his personal views and ambitions. Pavel was known for his desire to restore autocratic power and challenge the reforms and policies implemented by his mother. One of the central aspects of Pavel's reign was his effort to overhaul the Russian military. He implemented a series of military reforms aimed at modernizing the armed forces and improving their efficiency. These reforms included changes to military organization, training, and discipline. Pavel's focus on military reforms was partly motivated by his own experiences and military background. However, his reforms were often seen as rigid and impractical, leading to dissatisfaction among military officers and troops. Pavel's domestic policies also included attempts to reinstate traditional autocratic authority and reduce the influence of the nobility. He sought to limit the power of the nobility and reduce their privileges, which created tension and resistance among the aristocracy. His efforts to centralize power and enforce strict regulations were met with hostility from those who had benefited from the more liberal policies of his mother's reign. Another significant aspect of Pavel's rule was his foreign policy. His reign was marked by attempts to assert Russia's influence and protect its interests in Europe. Pavel's foreign policy was characterized by shifts in alliances and strategic adjustments. For instance, he pursued a more neutral stance in the ongoing European conflicts, seeking to distance Russia from some of the major powers of the time. Pavel's reign was also marked by controversy and internal dissent. His autocratic approach, combined with unpopular policies and reforms, led to growing discontent among various factions within the empire. This discontent culminated in a conspiracy among a group of disaffected nobles and military officers. The discontent and opposition ultimately led to a coup d'état on March 11, 1801. Pavel was forcibly removed from the throne and murdered in his palace. The coup was orchestrated by a group of conspirators who sought to replace Pavel with his son, Alexander I, who would go on to rule as Emperor Alexander I. Pavel I's reign, though brief, had a significant impact on Russian history. His efforts to restore autocratic control, implement military reforms, and navigate complex foreign relations left a lasting legacy. The abrupt end to his reign and the transition to Alexander I marked a shift in Russian policies and set the stage for the subsequent developments in the early 19th century. The period of Alexander I, who reigned from 1801 to 1825, was a transformative era in Russian history marked by significant domestic reforms, involvement in major European conflicts, and shifts in foreign policy. Alexander I ascended to the throne following the assassination of his father, Pavel I, and his reign was characterized by a complex blend of liberal reforms and conservative policies. Initially, Alexander I was seen as a reformer and an advocate of enlightened ideas. His early years on the throne were marked by a series of domestic reforms aimed at modernizing Russia and addressing some of the issues that had plagued his father's reign. Alexander introduced several changes in administrative practices, including the establishment of new governmental institutions and efforts to reduce corruption. He also sought to improve education and promote intellectual and cultural development, encouraging the growth of a more enlightened and educated society. Alexander's foreign policy was a major aspect of his reign. He played a pivotal role in the Napoleonic Wars, aligning Russia with various European coalitions against Napoleon Bonaparte. His leadership was instrumental in the defeat of Napoleon, particularly during the Russian campaign of 1812, which was a turning point in the conflict. Alexander's diplomatic efforts at the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, helped shape the post-war order in Europe, and he emerged as a key figure in the negotiations that redrew European boundaries and established a new balance of power. Despite his early reputation as a reformer, Alexander's later years were marked by a shift towards more conservative policies. This shift was influenced by a combination of factors, including the challenges of maintaining control over a vast empire and the rising tide of revolutionary and nationalist movements across Europe. Alexander became increasingly cautious about political reform and was wary of the revolutionary ideas that were spreading throughout the continent. One of the most significant events of Alexander's later reign was the Decembrist Revolt of 1825. This uprising, led by a group of liberal-minded military officers and intellectuals, sought to challenge the autocratic system and push for constitutional reforms. The revolt was quickly suppressed by the new Tsar, Nicholas I, who succeeded Alexander I after his death. The suppression of the Decembrists marked a turning point in Russian politics, leading to a more repressive and conservative approach under Nicholas I. Alexander I's reign was marked by a complex and evolving approach to governance. His early reforms and efforts to modernize Russia were counterbalanced by a more conservative stance in his later years. His involvement in European affairs and the defeat of Napoleon established Russia as a dominant power on the continent, while his domestic policies and response to revolutionary movements set the stage for the challenges that would face his successor. The reign of Nicholas I, which lasted from 1825 to 1855, was marked by a period of conservatism, autocratic rule, and attempts to maintain stability within the Russian Empire amid a rapidly changing Europe. Nicholas I ascended to the throne following the death of his elder brother, Alexander I, and the brief, tumultuous reign of his other brother, Constantine. His accession came amidst the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, an uprising by military officers seeking political reform and a constitutional government. Nicholas I's swift and decisive suppression of the revolt set the tone for his reign, which was characterized by a firm stance against political dissent and a commitment to preserving autocratic rule. Nicholas I's domestic policies focused on centralizing authority and reinforcing the power of the monarchy. He was known for his rigorous enforcement of conservative principles and a strict adherence to autocracy. His administration employed extensive surveillance and censorship to suppress revolutionary and reformist ideas. The third section of the Imperial Chancellery, a secret police force, was established to monitor and control political activities and maintain internal security. The reign of Nicholas I also saw significant efforts to strengthen and modernize the Russian military. He implemented reforms aimed at improving military organization, training, and discipline. His reign was marked by a series of military conflicts, including the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, which was fought against an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Sardinia. The war exposed significant weaknesses in the Russian military and administrative systems, leading to a reassessment of military strategies and reforms. Nicholas I's foreign policy was characterized by a desire to maintain Russian influence and protect its interests in Europe and beyond. He sought to assert Russian dominance in the Balkans and the Black Sea region, often clashing with other European powers over strategic interests. His involvement in the Greek War of Independence and the subsequent intervention in the Ottoman Empire were part of his broader strategy to expand Russian influence. Despite his efforts to maintain stability and control, Nicholas I faced growing discontent and criticism. His repressive policies and resistance to reform contributed to social and political tensions within the empire. The conditions of serfs remained largely unchanged during his reign, and the rigid class system continued to cause social unrest. Nicholas I's reign ended with his death in 1855, during the ongoing Crimean War. His policies and approach to governance left a legacy of autocratic rule and repressive measures that influenced the subsequent reign of his successor, Alexander II, who would eventually initiate significant reforms aimed at addressing some of the issues that had been suppressed under Nicholas I. Alexander II, who reigned from 1855 to 1881, is known for his significant reforms and efforts to modernize the Russian Empire. His era was marked by attempts to address deep-seated social, economic, and political issues, reflecting a response to internal pressures and the need for modernization. One of the most notable reforms of Alexander II's era was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. This landmark reform aimed to address the widespread social and economic problems associated with serfdom. The Emancipation Edict freed millions of serfs from their feudal obligations and granted them the right to own property and engage in economic activities. However, while the reform was a significant step forward, it was criticized for its implementation, which often left the newly freed serfs burdened with debt and facing challenges in acquiring land. In addition to serf emancipation, Alexander II introduced a series of judicial reforms. The 1864 judicial reform sought to create a more transparent and equitable legal system. It established an independent judiciary, introduced trial by jury, and aimed to reduce corruption and improve the efficiency of the courts. The reform was intended to modernize the legal system and ensure greater fairness in legal proceedings. The reform of local government was another key aspect of Alexander II's policies. The 1864 reforms established a system of elected local councils, known as zemstvos, which were responsible for local administration and public services. The zemstvos were intended to provide a degree of self-governance and improve local infrastructure, education, and health services. While the reforms represented a move towards decentralization and increased local participation, they were limited in scope and did not challenge the overall autocratic structure of the government. Alexander II also undertook military reforms aimed at modernizing and professionalizing the Russian army. These reforms included changes in military organization, training, and conscription. The introduction of universal conscription, which required all eligible men to serve in the military, was part of a broader effort to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the armed forces. These changes were intended to address the shortcomings revealed during the Crimean War and prepare the army for future conflicts. Despite these reforms, Alexander II's era was marked by increasing political unrest and radicalism. The growth of revolutionary movements and demands for more profound changes to the political system posed challenges to the existing order. The assassination of Alexander II in 1881 by a group of radical revolutionaries highlighted the growing tension and dissatisfaction with the pace and scope of his reforms. In summary, Alexander II's era was characterized by significant efforts to modernize and reform various aspects of Russian society, including the abolition of serfdom, judicial and local government reforms, and military modernization. While these reforms represented important steps towards modernization, they also faced limitations and challenges, contributing to the complex and turbulent political climate of the time. Alexander III, who reigned from 1881 to 1894, was known for his conservative and reactionary policies, which marked a significant shift from the reformist era of his father, Alexander II. Following the assassination of his father, Alexander III sought to reinforce autocratic rule and suppress political dissent. One of Alexander III's key policies was a reversal of many of the reforms introduced by his father. He focused on consolidating the power of the monarchy and reducing the influence of reformist and revolutionary elements. His reign was characterized by a crackdown on political dissent and increased repression of revolutionary and liberal movements. The government strengthened its control over the press, restricted public gatherings, and used secret police to monitor and suppress opposition. Alexander III also pursued a policy of Russification, which aimed to strengthen the dominance of Russian culture and the Orthodox Church across the empire's diverse ethnic and religious groups. This policy involved promoting the Russian language and culture, while simultaneously suppressing local languages, cultures, and religious practices. The Russification efforts were particularly pronounced in regions with significant non-Russian populations, such as Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. This approach aimed to create a more unified and centralized Russian identity, but often led to resentment and resistance among the affected populations. In terms of economic policy, Alexander III supported industrialization and economic development. His reign saw continued growth in infrastructure projects, including the expansion of railways, which facilitated trade and movement within the empire. The government encouraged the development of heavy industry and sought to modernize the economy, though these efforts were often overshadowed by the political repression of the period. Alexander III's domestic policies were marked by an emphasis on stability and order, with a focus on maintaining autocratic control and suppressing revolutionary activities. His approach to governance was influenced by his desire to avoid the political upheaval and reformist pressures that characterized his father's reign. While his policies succeeded in stabilizing the empire and maintaining autocratic rule, they also contributed to growing social and political tensions that would later erupt in the early 20th century. In summary, Alexander III's reign was characterized by a conservative reaction against the reforms of his father, a focus on reinforcing autocratic power, and efforts to promote Russification and industrial development. His policies aimed to stabilize and consolidate the Russian Empire, but they also intensified political repression and contributed to the underlying tensions that would shape Russia's future. Nicholas II, who reigned from 1894 to 1917, presided over a period of significant social, political, and economic upheaval in Russia. His reign was marked by attempts at reform as well as increasing political instability and revolutionary activity. In the early years of Nicholas II's reign, he faced considerable pressure to address the growing demands for political reform and social change. One of the major reforms during his reign was the introduction of the October Manifesto in 1905, a response to the widespread unrest and demands for constitutional changes. This document promised a range of reforms, including the establishment of a representative legislative body known as the Duma, which would have the power to enact laws and participate in governance. The manifesto was intended to quell the revolutionary fervor and provide a measure of political representation, but the actual implementation of these reforms was limited and often undermined by the autocratic tendencies of Nicholas II. The establishment of the Duma was a significant step towards political reform, but Nicholas II and his government often found ways to circumvent its authority. The Duma's powers were restricted, and the Tsar retained substantial control over key aspects of governance. Subsequent Dumas faced difficulties in enacting meaningful reforms, as Nicholas II frequently dissolved them when they opposed his policies. In terms of economic policy, Nicholas II's reign saw continued industrial growth and modernization. The expansion of the railway network, development of heavy industry, and growth of urban centers were notable aspects of this period. However, economic development did not fully address the deep-seated social inequalities and dissatisfaction among the working class and peasantry. The reign of Nicholas II was also marked by significant social and political unrest. The 1905 revolution, which included widespread strikes, protests, and demands for political reform, highlighted the growing discontent with the autocratic regime. The repression of revolutionary movements, including the use of military force, contributed to ongoing tensions and dissatisfaction. The early 20th century was a period of increasing crisis for Nicholas II. The involvement of Russia in World War I exacerbated existing problems, including economic strain, military setbacks, and social unrest. The war put immense pressure on the Russian economy and military, and the hardships faced by soldiers and civilians further fueled discontent. The final years of Nicholas II's reign were marked by significant turmoil, culminating in the February Revolution of 1917. Widespread strikes, protests, and demands for political change led to the abdication of Nicholas II and the end of the Romanov dynasty. The abdication marked the end of imperial rule in Russia and the beginning of a transitional period leading to the Bolshevik Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union. In summary, Nicholas II's reign was characterized by a mix of attempted reforms, including the introduction of the Duma and economic modernization, as well as significant challenges, including political repression, social unrest, and the impact of World War I. His inability to effectively address the growing demands for change and the pressures of the war ultimately contributed to the collapse of the autocratic regime and the revolutionary upheavals that followed. The First Russo-Japanese War, which occurred from 1904 to 1905, was a conflict between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan over rival interests in Manchuria and Korea. This war was a significant event in the early 20th century, highlighting the emergence of Japan as a major world power and marking a turning point in East Asian geopolitics. The origins of the war lay in the competing imperial ambitions of Russia and Japan in East Asia. Both countries sought to expand their influence in Korea and Manchuria, regions that were strategically and economically important. Russia's expansionist policies in the region, particularly its interest in securing a warm water port in the Pacific, clashed with Japan's aspirations to dominate Korea and parts of Manchuria. The conflict began with a surprise Japanese naval attack on the Russian fleet stationed at Port Arthur in February 1904. This preemptive strike was part of Japan's broader strategy to secure naval superiority and disrupt Russian operations. The initial phase of the war saw Japan achieving significant victories, including the successful blockade of Port Arthur and the sinking of several Russian warships. Land battles soon followed, with Japan launching offensives in Manchuria. The siege of Port Arthur, which lasted from August 1904 to January 1905, was a pivotal event. Japanese forces, led by General Nogi Mersuk, eventually captured the heavily fortified Russian base after intense and protracted fighting. This victory was a major blow to Russian morale and strategic interests. Another key engagement was the Battle of Mukden in February-March 1905. It was one of the largest land battles of the war and resulted in a decisive Japanese victory. The Russian forces, led by General Alexei Kuropatkin, were forced to retreat, further weakening Russia's position in the conflict. The naval battle of Tsushima, fought in May 1905, was another critical turning point. The Japanese Navy, under Admiral Hayakairo Togo, decisively defeated the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had traveled halfway around the world to engage in the conflict. This victory ensured Japan's control over the sea routes and cemented its naval dominance. The war ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The treaty recognized Japan's territorial gains, including control over Korea and Port Arthur, and ceded the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. In return, Japan agreed to relinquish claims on the northern part of Sakhalin and to respect Russia's interests in Manchuria. The outcome of the Russo-Japanese War had profound implications. It marked the first time an Asian power defeated a major European power in the modern era, signaling a shift in global power dynamics. The war also exposed weaknesses in the Russian military and contributed to domestic unrest, which would later play a role in the Russian Revolution of 1905. The conflict enhanced Japan's status as a formidable imperial power and set the stage for its increased influence in the region. The 1905 revolution in Russia was a wave of mass political and social unrest that swept through the Russian Empire in response to growing discontent with the autocratic regime of Tsar Nicholas II. The revolution was triggered by a combination of factors, including the recent defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, economic hardship, political repression, and a desire for reform. The immediate catalyst for the revolution was the events of Bloody Sunday, which occurred on January 22, 1905. On this day, a large group of workers and their families, led by the Orthodox priest Georgy Gapon, organized a peaceful march to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar. The petition called for reforms such as improved working conditions, political freedoms, and the establishment of a constitutional government. However, as the demonstrators approached the palace, they were met with gunfire from the Imperial Guard, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of protesters. This brutal repression shocked the nation and ignited widespread anger and protests. Following Bloody Sunday, the unrest spread rapidly throughout the empire. Strikes, demonstrations, and violent clashes became common as workers, peasants, and intellectuals voiced their grievances. The discontent was fueled by economic hardships, including rising food prices and poor working conditions, as well as the repressive policies of the autocratic government. Peasant uprisings occurred in rural areas, where dissatisfaction with land ownership and serfdom-related issues led to increased agitation. The revolution saw the rise of various political movements and organizations demanding change. Liberal groups called for constitutional reforms, while revolutionary socialists and anarchists pushed for more radical changes. The diverse range of demands and the lack of a unified leadership made it challenging for the movement to present a coherent set of goals. In response to the crisis, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, which promised to create a representative legislative body called the Duma, grant civil liberties such as freedom of speech and assembly, and undertake a range of reforms aimed at addressing some of the grievances of the revolutionaries. The manifesto was intended to placate the discontented populace and stabilize the situation. The establishment of the Duma marked a significant political concession, but the reforms were often criticized for being limited and failing to address deeper structural issues. The Tsar retained substantial autocratic powers, and the Duma's authority was frequently undermined by the government. The revolution did lead to some changes, including the creation of a more open political environment and increased participation in governance, but it also set the stage for future political struggles. The 1905 revolution ultimately did not achieve its goal of fully transforming the political system or ending autocratic rule. However, it was a crucial turning point in Russian history, revealing the deep-seated discontent with the Tsarist regime and foreshadowing the more profound upheavals that would follow in the early 20th century. The events of 1905 contributed to the growing momentum for political and social change, which would eventually culminate in the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Dumas were legislative bodies established in Russia as part of the political reforms initiated by Tsar Nicholas II in the wake of the 1905 revolution. They represented an attempt to introduce a degree of political representation and participation in the governance of the Russian Empire. The creation of the Dumas was a response to widespread discontent and demands for political reform. Following the October Manifesto of 1905, which promised greater civil liberties and the establishment of a representative assembly, the first Duma was convened in 1906. This legislative body was intended to be a consultative and legislative institution, where representatives elected from various social classes and regions could debate and propose legislation. The first Duma, which met from April to July 1906, was characterized by a high level of political activism and debate. It included a diverse range of representatives, including liberals, socialists, and conservatives. However, it faced significant limitations and challenges. The Tsar retained substantial control over the government and the legislative process, and the Duma's powers were restricted. The relationship between the Tsar and the Duma was strained, and the government was reluctant to make meaningful concessions to the representatives. The First Duma was dissolved by Nicholas II in July 1906 after only a few months, primarily due to its opposition to the government's policies and its demands for more extensive reforms. This dissolution was followed by the convening of the Second Duma in 1907. The Second Duma, which met from February to June 1907, was also marked by political contention and conflict. It was more radical than the First Duma, with a stronger presence of socialist and revolutionary elements. The government, fearing the growing influence of radical groups, dissolved the Second Duma after just a few months and introduced changes to the electoral system to reduce the representation of these radical elements. The Third Duma, which began its work in 1907 and lasted until 1912, was characterized by a more conservative composition due to the electoral changes that had been implemented. This Duma was more cooperative with the government and had a somewhat more stable relationship with the Tsar. It was able to pass some legislation, including reforms in education and local government, but its influence remained limited. The Fourth and final Duma, which met from 1912 to 1917, continued to operate under the constraints imposed by the Tsarist regime. It faced ongoing tensions with the government, particularly in the context of the First World War and increasing political unrest. The Duma was ultimately dissolved in 1917 following the February Revolution, which led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the end of the Romanov dynasty. Overall, while the Dumas represented a significant step towards political reform and greater representation, their effectiveness was limited by the autocratic control of the Tsar and the restrictive nature of the reforms. They played a role in the evolving political landscape of Russia, but were unable to fully address the underlying issues and demands for change that would later lead to the more profound revolutionary upheavals of 1917. During World War I, Russia was a major Allied power, facing significant challenges both on and off the battlefield. The war began in August 1914, with Russia joining the conflict in support of its allies, primarily France and the United Kingdom, against the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The early stages of the war saw Russia engaging in several major campaigns, particularly on the Eastern Front. Russia's initial military strategy involved large-scale offensives against German and Austro-Hungarian forces. While the Russian armies achieved some early successes, they were eventually met with strong resistance and suffered significant defeats, particularly in the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, where German forces inflicted a crushing defeat on the Russian Second Army. As the war progressed, Russia faced numerous difficulties. The Eastern Front saw continuous and brutal fighting, with both sides enduring heavy casualties. Russia struggled with logistical issues, including inadequate infrastructure and supply lines, which hindered its ability to sustain prolonged military operations. The Russian army was also plagued by problems such as poor leadership, outdated equipment, and low morale among the troops. The impact of the war on Russian society was profound. The conflict exacerbated existing social and economic problems, leading to widespread hardship and discontent. The war effort placed enormous strain on the Russian economy, causing shortages of food, fuel, and other essential goods. Inflation soared, and the civilian population faced severe hardships, including food shortages and high prices. The war also contributed to significant political unrest. The inefficiencies and failures of the war effort, coupled with growing dissatisfaction with the autocratic regime of Tsar Nicholas II, led to increasing demands for political reform. The Russian monarchy, already weakened by previous political upheavals, faced mounting criticism for its handling of the war and domestic issues. The February Revolution of 1917 was a direct result of the war's impact on Russian society. Widespread strikes, protests, and unrest led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the end of the Romanov dynasty. The revolution established a provisional government, which faced the challenge of continuing the war effort while addressing the demands for political and social reform. The new provisional government, led by figures such as Alexander Kerensky, struggled to maintain stability and meet the demands of various factions. The ongoing war effort remained highly unpopular, and the situation continued to deteriorate. The Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, capitalized on the widespread discontent and anti-war sentiment, ultimately leading to the October Revolution of 1917. The October Revolution resulted in the Bolsheviks seizing power and establishing a communist government. One of the first major actions of the new Soviet government was to seek an end to Russia's involvement in World War I. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918 with the Central Powers, officially ended Russia's participation in the war. The treaty ceded significant territories to Germany and its allies, marking a significant territorial and political concession for the Soviet government. In summary, Russia's involvement in World War I was marked by significant military struggles, economic hardships, and political upheaval. The war played a crucial role in the collapse of the Russian Empire, the overthrow of the Tsarist regime, and the rise of the Bolshevik government, setting the stage for the Russian Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union. The Bolshevik Uprising, also known as the October Revolution, was a key event in Russian history that took place in October 1917, Julian calendar, or November 1917, Gregorian calendar. It was a pivotal moment in the Russian Revolution, leading to the establishment of a Bolshevik government and setting the stage for the creation of the Soviet Union. The uprising was led by the Bolshevik Party, a radical socialist faction headed by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks were dissatisfied with the provisional government, which had been established after the February Revolution of 1917 and was perceived as ineffective in addressing the pressing issues of war, economic hardship, and social reform. The immediate catalyst for the Bolshevik uprising was the growing dissatisfaction with the provisional government's continued participation in World War I and its failure to address the needs of workers, soldiers, and peasants. The provisional government, led by figures such as Alexander Kerensky, faced increasing opposition from various political factions, including the Bolsheviks, who promised to end the war, redistribute land, and address the grievances of the working class. In the weeks leading up to the uprising, the Bolsheviks, supported by their allies in the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, began to prepare for a decisive move against the provisional government. They gained support from key sectors of society, including workers, soldiers, and sailors, particularly in the major cities of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, and Moscow. On the night of October 25 to 26, 1917, Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks launched their planned insurrection. The uprising began with the seizure of key government and military facilities in Petrograd. The Bolshevik Red Guards, supported by sympathetic soldiers and sailors, took control of the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, and other strategic locations in the city. The takeover of the Winter Palace was relatively swift and met with minimal resistance. Key members of the provisional government were arrested, and the Bolsheviks declared that power had been transferred to the Soviet government. The uprising was marked by relatively few casualties and a rapid consolidation of power by the Bolsheviks. Following the success of the uprising, the Bolsheviks established a new government, known as the Council of People's Commissars, with Vladimir Lenin as its head. The Bolshevik government quickly moved to implement its policies, including the withdrawal from World War I, the nationalization of land and industry, and the redistribution of land to peasants. The Bolshevik uprising was a significant turning point in Russian history, leading to the collapse of the provisional government and the beginning of Bolshevik rule. It set the stage for the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1917 to 1923 and resulted in the consolidation of Bolshevik power and the establishment of the Soviet Union. The October Revolution is often regarded as one of the most important events of the 20th century, shaping the course of Russian and global history. The Kornilov Rebellion, also known as the Kornilov Affair, was a significant political and military crisis that occurred in Russia in August-September 1917 during the tumultuous period of the Russian Revolution. It was a key event in the lead-up to the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917. The rebellion was named after its principal figure, General Lavr Kornilov, who was the commander-in-chief of the Russian army. Kornilov, a prominent military leader, was increasingly disillusioned with the provisional government's handling of the war and the domestic situation. He viewed the government, led by Alexander Kerensky and the Socialist Revolutionary Party, as weak and ineffective in addressing the urgent needs of the country and stabilizing the situation. In August 1917, Kornilov began to take military action that he claimed was aimed at restoring order and supporting the provisional government. However, his actions were seen by many as an attempted coup. Kornilov mobilized troops and advanced towards Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, intending to impose military discipline and possibly seize control of the government. His motivations were partly driven by his frustration with the government's inability to quell revolutionary fervor and maintain effective control over the army. Kerensky, who was both the head of the provisional government and Minister of War, initially supported Kornilov, hoping that the general's military prowess would help stabilize the situation. However, as Kornilov's intentions became clearer, Kerensky and his government grew concerned that Kornilev's actions were a threat to their authority and to the democratic reforms they had implemented. Kerensky responded by mobilizing the Red Guards, a paramilitary force loyal to the provisional government and the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, to defend Petrograd. The government also sought to undermine Kornilev's support by convincing his troops to desert or switch allegiances. The situation quickly escalated into a standoff between Kornilev's forces and the defenders of Petrograd. The Kornilev rebellion was ultimately thwarted. Kornilev's forces were halted, and the rebellion lost momentum. Kornilev himself was arrested, and his political and military ambitions were thwarted. The failure of the rebellion led to Kornilev being discredited and losing his position as commander-in-chief. The Kornilev rebellion had significant consequences for the political landscape of Russia. It weakened the provisional government and exposed its vulnerability. The events also helped to discredit the provisional government and contribute to the rise of the Bolsheviks, who capitalized on the growing discontent with the government and its inability to address the needs of the people. The rebellion further polarized the political situation and set the stage for the October Revolution, which would bring the Bolsheviks to power and lead to the establishment of Soviet rule. The November Revolution, also known as the October Revolution in the Julian calendar used by Russia at the time, was a pivotal event in the Russian Revolution of 1917. It occurred on October 25th to 26th, Julian calendar, or November 7th to 8th, Gregorian calendar, and marked the Bolshevik seizure of power from the provisional government. The revolution was led by the Bolshevik Party, headed by Vladimir Lenin, who had been advocating for a radical transformation of Russian society. By October 1917, the provisional government, which had taken power after the February Revolution and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, was facing widespread criticism for its failure to address pressing issues such as the ongoing involvement in World War I, economic hardships, and social reform. The Bolsheviks, who had gained significant support from workers, soldiers, and peasants, saw an opportunity to capitalize on the widespread dissatisfaction with the provisional government. They prepared for a decisive move to overthrow the existing regime and establish a government based on their socialist principles. The uprising began with a coordinated effort by the Bolsheviks to seize key government and military facilities in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. The plan was to take control of strategic locations, including the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was based. The Bolsheviks' Red Guards, supported by sympathetic soldiers and sailors, carried out these actions with relative ease. The initial stages of the uprising were marked by relatively little resistance. The Red Guards quickly occupied key points in the city, and the takeover of the Winter Palace was accomplished with minimal violence. The members of the provisional government were arrested, and the Bolsheviks declared that power had been transferred to the Soviet government. The revolution was followed by a period of consolidation as the Bolsheviks moved to solidify their control. They issued decrees addressing key issues such as the withdrawal from World War I, the redistribution of land, and the nationalization of industry. The new government, known as the Council of People's Commissars, was led by Lenin and aimed to implement socialist policies. The November Revolution was a critical turning point in Russian history, leading to the end of the provisional government and the beginning of Bolshevik rule. It set the stage for the Russian Civil War, which lasted until 1923 and resulted in the consolidation of Bolshevik power and the establishment of the Soviet Union. The revolution had far-reaching consequences, shaping the political and social landscape of Russia and influencing global geopolitics in the 20th century. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918, was a peace treaty between the Soviet government of Russia and the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The treaty marked Russia's exit from World War I and was a significant event in the aftermath of the October Revolution. The treaty negotiations began in December 1917, following the Bolshevik seizure of power and the establishment of a Soviet government under Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks had promised to withdraw Russia from the war as part of their campaign platform, and they sought to negotiate a peace settlement with the Central Powers to fulfill this promise. The negotiations were held in Brest-Litovsk, a town in present-day Belarus. The terms of the treaty were harsh and reflected the military and political leverage that the Central Powers held over the Soviet government. The treaty ceded significant territories to Germany and its allies. Russia agreed to recognize the independence of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were occupied by the Central Powers. Additionally, Russia ceded control over the region of Poland and parts of the Caucasus. In exchange for these territorial concessions, the Central Powers agreed to end their military operations against Russia and recognize the Soviet government. The treaty effectively removed Russia from the conflict, allowing the Central Powers to concentrate their efforts on other fronts. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was highly controversial and faced significant opposition within Russia. Many Russians viewed the treaty as a betrayal and a humiliating concession to the enemy. The loss of territory and the perceived betrayal of national interests fueled discontent and criticism among various factions, including those within the Soviet government and among the general populace. The treaty was eventually nullified following Germany's defeat in World War I and the signing of the armistice in November 1918. The subsequent Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, redrew the borders of Europe and restored some of the territories ceded by the Brest-Litovsk Treaty to their respective nations. Despite its contentious nature, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a crucial step in solidifying Bolshevik control over Russia and consolidating the Soviet regime. It allowed the Bolsheviks to focus on internal consolidation and the Russian Civil War, which was essential for the establishment of Soviet rule and the eventual creation of the Soviet Union. The Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1917 to 1923, was a complex and multifaceted conflict that emerged in the wake of the October Revolution and the Bolshevik seizure of power. It was a struggle for control of Russia between the Bolsheviks, who had overthrown the provisional government and established a Soviet regime, and a diverse coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, collectively known as the White Army, as well as other factions. The Civil War was marked by a series of overlapping and shifting alliances, regional conflicts, and ideological battles. The main parties involved included the Red Army, the military forces of the Bolshevik government, led by figures like Leon Trotsky. The Red Army was committed to defending the Soviet regime and its revolutionary goals. The White Army, a loosely organized coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, which included former Tsarist officers, conservative nationalists, and other groups opposed to Bolshevik rule. The White Army lacked a unified command and coherent strategy, leading to internal divisions and competing interests. The Green Army, a term used to describe various peasant armies and local self-defense units that were not directly aligned with either the Reds or the Whites. They were primarily concerned with local issues and resistance against both Bolshevik and White forces. The Black Army, anarchist forces led by figures like Nestor Makhno, who operated mainly in Ukraine. They sought to establish anarchist communes and were involved in both fighting the Reds and resisting White forces. The Civil War was characterized by widespread violence, devastation, and suffering. The conflict saw numerous battles and campaigns across Russia, with significant fighting occurring in the western regions, the south, and the east. Major fronts included the Eastern Front, where the Red Army faced off against the White forces led by generals like Anton Denikin and Pyotr Wrangel, and the Southern Front, where the White Army sought to capture key cities and resources. The Bolsheviks employed a range of strategies to consolidate their power. They used propaganda to promote their cause and garner support among workers, peasants, and soldiers. The Bolsheviks also implemented policies such as the nationalization of industry and land redistribution, which helped them gain the support of the working class and rural populations. The Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, was known for its organizational discipline, effective mobilization, and use of political commissars to maintain loyalty and ideological commitment. The Bolsheviks also utilized the Chaika, a secret police organization, to suppress dissent and maintain control over occupied territories. The White Army, despite receiving some support from foreign powers such as Britain, France, and the United States, struggled with internal divisions and a lack of coherent leadership. Their inability to present a unified front or offer a clear alternative to Bolshevik rule weakened their position and contributed to their eventual defeat. The Civil War ended with the consolidation of Bolshevik power and the establishment of the Soviet Union in December 1922. The conflict had profound effects on Russian society, including widespread casualties, economic destruction, and political repression. The aftermath of the Civil War saw the Bolsheviks solidify their control over the country, leading to the establishment of a one-party communist state and the beginning of Soviet rule. The Polish-Soviet War, fought from 1919 to 1921, was a conflict between the newly established Second Polish Republic and Soviet Russia. The war was primarily a struggle for control over territories in Eastern Europe and was influenced by competing nationalistic and ideological interests. The origins of the war can be traced back to the collapse of the Russian Empire and the subsequent power vacuum in Eastern Europe following World War I. Poland, which had regained its independence in 1918 after more than a century of partition, sought to secure its borders and expand its territory. Soviet Russia, under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, aimed to spread communist revolution and reclaim territories lost during the Russian Empire's decline. The conflict began with clashes between Polish and Soviet forces over disputed territories. Key areas of contention included parts of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, which both Poland and Soviet Russia claimed. The initial stages of the war saw significant fighting, with both sides aiming to assert control over these strategically important regions. In 1920, the war reached its climax with the Battle of Warsaw, also known as the Miracle on the Vistula. The battle was a decisive confrontation in which Polish forces, led by Marshal Józef Pilsudski, managed to repel the advancing Soviet Red Army. The Polish victory was crucial in halting the Soviet advance and preventing the spread of Bolshevism into Central Europe. The Treaty of Riga, signed on March 18, 1921, officially ended the conflict. The treaty established the borders between Poland and Soviet Russia, with Poland gaining control over significant territories in Ukraine and Belarus. The agreement marked a major diplomatic and military success for Poland and set the stage for the establishment of a stable Polish state. The Polish-Soviet War had lasting effects on the region. It solidified Poland's independence and territorial claims, while also impacting Soviet Russia's ambitions in Eastern Europe. The conflict highlighted the ideological and geopolitical struggles of the post-World War I period and contributed to the shaping of the political landscape in Eastern Europe during the early 20th century. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union, established after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, was in a period of consolidation and transformation. The decade was marked by significant political, economic, and social changes as the new communist government solidified its control and sought to reshape Soviet society. The Soviet government, led initially by Vladimir Lenin and later by Joseph Stalin, focused on consolidating power and addressing the challenges of post-revolutionary Russia. The early 1920s were a time of rebuilding and stabilization following the Russian Civil War and the devastation of World War I. The Soviet regime faced numerous challenges, including economic disruption, political instability, and the need to integrate diverse regions and peoples into a unified Soviet state. One of the key policies during this period was the new economic policy, NEP, introduced by Lenin in 1921. The NEP was a pragmatic approach aimed at reviving the war-torn economy by allowing limited private enterprise and market mechanisms in agriculture and small-scale industry. This policy sought to address food shortages, stimulate production, and rebuild the economy while maintaining overall control by the state. The NEP was relatively successful in stabilizing the economy and improving living conditions, but it was also controversial among more radical elements within the Communist Party. Politically, the 1920s saw the consolidation of Bolshevik power and the suppression of opposition. The Communist Party, under Lenin's leadership, worked to eliminate rival factions and consolidate its control over the country. The early years of the decade were marked by internal party struggles, including disputes over policy and leadership succession. Lenin's health deteriorated after 1922, and his eventual death in 1924 led to a power struggle among prominent party leaders. Joseph Stalin emerged as a key figure in Soviet politics during this period. By the mid-1920s, Stalin had gained control over key party positions and began to consolidate his power. His rise to leadership marked a shift towards more centralized and authoritarian control. Stalin's policies and strategies were instrumental in shaping the direction of the Soviet Union in the years that followed. The Soviet Union also began to implement a series of ambitious industrial and agricultural policies. The focus on rapid industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture became central themes in Soviet policy. The Soviet government aimed to transform the largely agrarian economy into an industrial powerhouse, with a focus on heavy industry and large-scale production. The drive for collectivization sought to consolidate individual farms into state-controlled collective farms, with the goal of increasing agricultural productivity and supporting industrial growth. The 1920s were also a time of significant social change. The Soviet government implemented various reforms aimed at modernizing society and promoting socialist ideals. These included efforts to improve education, promote gender equality, and eliminate traditional social hierarchies. The Soviet regime sought to create a new socialist culture and identity, with a focus on promoting the values of Marxism-Leninism and building a collective Soviet identity. Overall, the 1920s were a formative period for the Soviet Union, characterized by efforts to rebuild the economy, consolidate political control, and implement social reforms. The policies and developments of this decade set the stage for the more radical changes and challenges of the 1930s, including the intensification of industrialization, the implementation of forced collectivization, and the establishment of Stalin's totalitarian regime. The 1930s were a pivotal decade for the Soviet Union, marked by significant and transformative events under Joseph Stalin's leadership. This period saw the consolidation of Stalin's totalitarian regime, radical economic and social policies, and widespread political repression. Stalin's rule became increasingly autocratic during the 1930s. He solidified his control over the Communist Party and the state apparatus, establishing a personal dictatorship. The decade began with a series of purges aimed at eliminating real or perceived political rivals and dissenters. The most infamous of these was the Great Purge, or Great Terror, of 1936 to 1938. During this campaign, Stalin targeted party officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, accusing them of counter-revolutionary activities and treason. The purges led to the arrest, imprisonment, and execution of hundreds of thousands of people, creating a climate of fear and repression throughout the Soviet Union. Economically, the 1930s were defined by Stalin's ambitious plans for rapid industrialization and collectivization. The first five-year plan, launched in 1928, aimed to transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower. The plan focused on developing heavy industry, such as steel production, mining, and machinery, while neglecting consumer goods. This drive for industrialization involved massive state investments and mobilization of resources, often at great human cost. Collectivization, the process of consolidating individual farms into large, state-controlled collective farms, was another key component of Stalin's economic policy. Initiated in the late 1920s and accelerated in the 1930s, collectivization aimed to increase agricultural productivity and support industrial growth. However, the policy faced significant resistance from peasants, leading to widespread violence, forced relocations, and severe food shortages. The disruption caused by collectivization resulted in a devastating famine, particularly in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, which led to millions of deaths. The 1930s also saw significant social changes in the Soviet Union. The government promoted a state-sponsored ideology that emphasized socialist realism in art and literature, requiring that cultural output reflect the values and achievements of socialism. Education and propaganda were used to inculcate Soviet citizens with communist ideals and loyalty to the state. The regime also implemented reforms aimed at promoting gender equality and improving the status of women, although these were often overshadowed by the broader political and economic turmoil. Foreign policy during the 1930s was marked by attempts to secure the Soviet Union's position on the global stage. The Soviet government sought to strengthen its position through diplomatic and military alliances, while also engaging in negotiations with Western powers to counter the rising threat of Nazi Germany. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, a non-aggression pact with Germany, was a significant event, as it effectively divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and paved the way for the invasion of Poland and the subsequent outbreak of World War II. Overall, the 1930s were a period of intense transformation and upheaval for the Soviet Union. Stalin's policies profoundly affected the nation's economy, society, and political landscape, shaping the course of Soviet history and setting the stage for the country's role in the coming global conflict. During World War II, Russia, then the Soviet Union, played a central role in the conflict, particularly on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's involvement began with the German invasion in June 1941 and lasted until the end of the war in 1945. This period was marked by intense and brutal warfare, significant sacrifices, and substantial contributions to the eventual Allied victory. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The surprise attack was intended to quickly defeat the Soviet forces and secure the Eastern Front, but it faced unexpected resistance. The Soviet Union, initially caught off guard, suffered significant losses, including vast territories and millions of casualties. The early months of the invasion saw rapid German advances and the encirclement of Soviet troops in large-scale battles, such as the Siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Moscow. Despite early setbacks, the Soviet Union managed to stabilize the front lines and launch counteroffensives. The harsh winter of 1941 to 1942 played a crucial role in halting the German advance towards Moscow. The Soviet Union's industrial capacity and the relocation of factories eastward beyond the Ural Mountains were pivotal in sustaining the war effort. The Soviet economy mobilized to produce war material, including tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The Soviet government also implemented measures to maintain morale and manage the war economy. The turning point on the Eastern Front came with the Soviet victory in the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in the summer of 1942 and ended in February 1943. The battle was one of the largest and bloodiest in history, with severe casualties on both sides. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked a significant shift in the war, leading to a series of Soviet offensives that pushed the German forces westward. The Soviet Union continued to press the offensive, reclaiming lost territories and advancing into Eastern Europe. Major battles such as the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, demonstrated the growing strength of the Soviet military. The Soviet offensives, including Operation Bagration in 1944, played a crucial role in driving German forces back and liberating occupied territories. The Soviet Union also endured tremendous human cost during the war. The conflict resulted in massive civilian and military casualties, with estimates of Soviet deaths ranging from 20 to 27 million, including those from the Holocaust and other war-related atrocities. The devastation included widespread destruction of cities, infrastructure, and a significant impact on the Soviet economy and society. The war in Europe concluded with the Soviet capture of Berlin in May 1945, leading to the unconditional surrender of Germany. The victory solidified the Soviet Union's role as a major global power and marked the beginning of Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, which would shape the post-war geopolitical landscape. Overall, the Soviet Union's involvement in World War II was characterized by immense sacrifice, resilience, and pivotal contributions to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The war left a lasting impact on the Soviet Union, both in terms of human cost and the geopolitical changes that followed. During the Cold War, which spanned from the end of World War II in 1945 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Soviet Union was a central actor in global geopolitics. The period was marked by ideological, political, and military rivalry between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc led by the United States. At the outset of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin until his death in 1953, established a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. This involved the imposition of communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. The Soviet regime supported these regimes both politically and militarily, aiming to spread and sustain communism as a counterbalance to Western democratic capitalism. The Cold War era saw a series of significant confrontations and crises between the superpowers. The Soviet Union engaged in a nuclear arms race with the United States, leading to the development of vast arsenals of nuclear weapons and the strategy of mutually assured destruction, MAD, as a deterrent against direct conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a high-stakes confrontation that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to a tense standoff with the United States. The Soviet Union also played a major role in several regional conflicts as part of its broader strategy to support communist movements and counter Western influence. This included involvement in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, where Soviet support for North Korea was countered by US and Allied support for South Korea. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union supported various revolutionary movements and regimes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often engaging in proxy wars with the United States and its allies. Domestically, the Soviet Union under leaders such as Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and later leaders, experienced periods of both reform and stagnation. Khrushchev's era included attempts at de-Stalinization and modest economic and political reforms. The Brezhnev period was characterized by a focus on stability and economic growth, though it also saw increasing political repression and corruption. The 1980s brought significant change with the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced reforms aimed at addressing economic stagnation and political rigidity. His policies of perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, sought to revitalize the Soviet economy and increase transparency in government. Gorbachev also pursued a policy of reducing Cold War tensions, leading to significant arms control agreements with the United States and a reduction in Soviet military commitments abroad. Despite these efforts, the Soviet Union faced mounting economic difficulties, political unrest, and growing demands for independence within its constituent republics. Nationalist movements and demands for greater autonomy became more pronounced, leading to a series of crises that undermined the central authority. The increasing pressure for reform, combined with economic problems, eventually contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, ending the Cold War era. The Cold War had a profound impact on global geopolitics, shaping the international order and influencing numerous conflicts and political developments throughout the 20th century. The Soviet Union's role during this period was marked by both its efforts to promote communism globally and its eventual struggle to adapt to changing internal and external circumstances. The collapse of the Soviet Union, which formally occurred on December 26, 1991, was a complex and multifaceted process involving political, economic, and social factors. The dissolution marked the end of a superpower and the emergence of 15 independent republics. The roots of the collapse lay in a series of long-standing issues and developments. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was facing severe stagnation. The centralized planning system proved inefficient, leading to chronic shortages of consumer goods, low productivity, and widespread corruption. The economic problems were compounded by the burden of maintaining a vast military apparatus and supporting a network of communist allies and client states. Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, recognized the need for reform to address these systemic issues. His policies of perestroika, restructuring, aimed at modernizing the economy and improving efficiency, while glasnost, openness, sought to increase transparency and encourage public discussion. Gorbachev's reforms were intended to rejuvenate the Soviet system, but they also exposed deep-seated problems and catalyzed demands for greater political freedom and autonomy. The relaxation of censorship and the introduction of limited political reforms led to a surge in public criticism and dissent. Nationalist movements within various Soviet republics, such as the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Georgia, gained momentum. These republics sought greater independence and autonomy, and their demands put pressure on the central government. The political landscape was further destabilized by a failed coup attempt in August 1991. Hardline elements within the Communist Party, opposed to Gorbachev's reforms, attempted to seize control in a bid to prevent the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The coup, known as the August coup, failed largely due to the resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR. The coup's failure significantly weakened Gorbachev's authority and accelerated the push for independence among the republics. By late 1991, the situation had deteriorated to the point where the Soviet Union was no longer able to maintain its central authority. The republics, driven by economic difficulties and nationalist aspirations, declared independence. On December 8, 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavisa Accords, which declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and announced the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. The official end of the Soviet Union was formalized on December 26, 1991, when the Soviet Supreme Soviet voted to dissolve the Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union had profound global implications. It ended the Cold War and led to significant geopolitical shifts, with the emergence of new independent states in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The dissolution also marked the end of communist rule in Russia and the other former Soviet republics, leading to a period of economic transition, political instability, and social upheaval as the new states navigated the challenges of establishing market economies and democratic institutions. In the early 2000s, Russia experienced significant political, economic, and social changes as it emerged from the tumultuous post-Soviet transition period. The era was marked by the consolidation of political power under President Vladimir Putin, economic recovery, and efforts to restore Russia's influence on the global stage. Vladimir Putin, who became president in December 1999 following the resignation of Boris Yeltsin, quickly established himself as a dominant figure in Russian politics. His leadership style was characterized by a centralization of power and a focus on restoring state control over key sectors of the economy, including the energy sector. Putin's presidency aimed to stabilize Russia after the chaotic 1990s and address the economic and political challenges that had emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Economically, Russia experienced a period of recovery and growth in the early 2000s. The global rise in oil prices significantly boosted Russia's economy, as the country is one of the world's largest oil and gas producers. The revenue from energy exports helped to stabilize the national economy, reduce the budget deficit, and build up foreign currency reserves. This economic growth led to improvements in living standards for many Russians and contributed to increased domestic and international confidence in Russia's economic prospects. Putin's administration implemented a series of economic reforms aimed at modernizing and strengthening the Russian economy. These included efforts to streamline tax collection, improve the investment climate, and address corruption. The government also sought to consolidate control over major industries and natural resources, often by reasserting state influence over previously privatized sectors. On the international stage, Russia sought to reassert its influence and restore its status as a major global player. Putin's foreign policy was marked by efforts to strengthen relationships with other countries and challenge the dominance of the United States and NATO. Russia engaged in a more assertive foreign policy, including strategic partnerships with countries like China and attempts to influence events in neighboring regions. Domestically, the early 2000s saw a consolidation of political power under Putin and the centralization of authority in the executive branch. The Kremlin implemented measures to strengthen control over the media and political institutions, reducing the power of regional governors and opposition forces. This centralization was justified by the need for political stability and effective governance, but also led to concerns about the erosion of democratic processes and political freedoms. Socially, the early 2000s were a period of relative stability and improvement compared to the 1990s. However, challenges remained, including disparities in wealth and regional development, as well as issues related to corruption and governance. The early 2000s set the stage for Russia's subsequent developments, including continued economic growth, increased political centralization, and ongoing efforts to navigate complex international relations. In the 2010s, Russia continued to experience significant political, economic, and social changes under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, who was re-elected as president in 2012 after serving as prime minister. The decade was marked by a series of domestic and international developments that shaped Russia's trajectory. Politically, Putin's administration maintained a firm grip on power, with an emphasis on strengthening central authority and suppressing dissent. The 2010s saw increased restrictions on political freedoms and a crackdown on opposition figures, independent media, and non-governmental organizations. Laws restricting political activism, including those targeting foreign-funded organizations, were enacted to limit dissent and consolidate state control. The political landscape was characterized by a lack of substantial opposition and a focus on maintaining stability and control. Economically, Russia faced both growth and challenges. The early part of the decade saw continued economic stability, bolstered by high oil prices and economic reforms. However, the situation changed dramatically with a decline in global oil prices starting in 2014, which led to economic difficulties. The drop in oil revenues, combined with international sanctions imposed in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine, contributed to economic stagnation and a decline in living standards for many Russians. Inflation, a weakening ruble, and economic contraction were notable issues during this period. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 marked a significant turning point in Russia's international relations. The move, which followed a disputed referendum, led to widespread condemnation from the international community and resulted in economic sanctions from Western countries. The sanctions targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, including finance, energy, and defense, and had a substantial impact on Russia's economic performance. The conflict in eastern Ukraine, involving pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government, also played a major role in shaping Russia's foreign policy and international relations. The conflict, which began in 2014, was characterized by ongoing violence and diplomatic tensions. Russia's support for separatists and its role in the conflict contributed to strained relations with Western countries and increased geopolitical isolation. Domestically, the 2010s saw efforts to assert Russian national identity and promote traditional values. The government emphasized patriotism and national pride, often framing its policies in opposition to perceived Western influence. There was a focus on reviving historical narratives and promoting a sense of Russian exceptionalism. The latter part of the decade also witnessed growing social and political discontent, with sporadic protests and demonstrations against corruption, economic hardship, and political repression. Despite these challenges, the government maintained a strong hold on power and continued to implement policies aimed at strengthening central authority and addressing economic difficulties. Overall, the 2010s were a period of political consolidation, economic challenges, and increased international tensions for Russia. The decade set the stage for ongoing geopolitical complexities and internal developments as Russia navigated a changing global landscape and sought to assert its influence on the world stage. In the 2020s, Russia faced a turbulent and transformative decade characterized by significant political, economic, and international developments. Political landscape. The early 2020s saw continued consolidation of power under Vladimir Putin, who has been in office in various capacities since 1999. In 2020, Russia held a constitutional referendum that allowed Putin to potentially extend his presidency beyond 2024. The referendum also included provisions to strengthen state control and reinforce conservative values. The results were widely criticized for alleged irregularities and lack of transparency. The decade witnessed increased political repression and crackdowns on dissent. High-profile opposition figures, such as Alexei Navalny, were targeted by the government. Navalny, a prominent anti-corruption activist and critic of Putin, survived a poisoning attempt in August 2020, which he and many international observers attributed to the Russian state. Upon returning to Russia in January 2021, Navalny was arrested and sentenced to prison, leading to widespread protests and international condemnation. Economic situation. The Russian economy faced several challenges in the early 2020s. The COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact, contributing to economic downturns and disruptions. The pandemic led to a contraction in economic activity, increased unemployment, and strain on the healthcare system. The Russian government implemented various measures to mitigate the economic impact, including stimulus packages and support for affected industries. The Russian economy also grappled with the effects of ongoing Western sanctions imposed in response to its foreign policies, including the annexation of Crimea and involvement in conflicts in Ukraine and Syria. These sanctions targeted key sectors such as finance, energy, and defense, affecting Russia's economic performance and limiting access to international markets. Foreign relations. The 2020s saw continued tension in Russia's international relations. The conflict with Ukraine remained a central issue, with ongoing hostilities in eastern Ukraine and continued disputes over Crimea. Relations with Western countries were strained, with geopolitical rivalries and diplomatic confrontations. The relationship with China grew closer, with increased cooperation in areas such as energy, trade, and military affairs. Russia and China deepened their strategic partnership, seeking to counterbalance Western influence and expand their global reach. Domestic developments. The Russian government continued to promote nationalist and conservative values, emphasizing traditionalism and national sovereignty. There were ongoing efforts to assert control over various aspects of society, including media, the internet, and civil society organizations. Protests and public discontent persisted over issues such as corruption, economic inequality, and political repression. The government responded with increased security measures and restrictions on public demonstrations, seeking to maintain control and prevent challenges to its authority. Military and security. Russia continued to invest in its military capabilities and assert its presence on the global stage. The country conducted various military exercises and maintained a robust defense posture. The military involvement in Syria, which began in 2015, continued into the 2020s, with Russia supporting the Assad regime and influencing the dynamics of the conflict. Overall, the 2020s for Russia were marked by political consolidation, economic challenges, and ongoing international tensions. The decade saw a focus on maintaining internal stability and asserting Russia's position in global affairs amidst a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape.